The neon Budweiser sign in O'Malley's window flickered against the early evening darkness, casting red and blue shadows across the rain-slicked pavement. Inside, the Tuesday night crowd was typical for a working-class neighborhood bar in Portland. A dozen regulars scattered across worn bar stools, the sound of a basketball game murmuring from the television mounted in the corner, and the familiar smell of beer, fried food, and decades of cigarette smoke that no amount of cleaning could ever fully erase. Sarah Mitchell wiped down the scarred oak bar with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic after 6 years of working the evening shift. At 32, she'd learned every rhythm of this place, when to refill a drink before being asked, when to engage in conversation, and when to simply let someone sit in comfortable silence with their thoughts and their beer. The tips weren't spectacular, but they were steady, and in a city where rent climbed higher every year while her paycheck stayed frozen. Steady was something to appreciate. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. Brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dark circles under hazel eyes that spoke of too many double shifts, a frame that was strong rather than delicate from years of hauling beer kegs and breaking up the occasional scuffle. Not glamorous, but competent. That's what she told herself on the hard days, the days when her daughter Emma's school sent home another notice about unpaid lunch fees, or when the check engine light came on in her 15-year-old Honda. "Sarah, honey, can I get another Sam Adams?" called out Walt from his usual spot at the far end of the bar. He was 73, a fixture at O'Malley's for longer than Sarah had been alive, with gnarled hands that shook slightly as he raised his glass. "You got it, Walt." She pulled the tap with smooth efficiency, tilting the glass at just the right angle to minimize the head. Walt had served in Vietnam, came back with shrapnel still lodged near his spine, and nightmares that occasionally made him cry out in his sleep. Or so he'd told her one late night when the bar was empty, and the loneliness got too heavy to carry alone. He lived on a fixed income in a studio apartment 3 blocks away, and O'Malley's was his social club, his community center, his connection to the world beyond 4 walls and a television. "How's Emma doing in school?" Walt asked as she set the fresh beer in front of him. "Good. She made the honor roll again." Sarah couldn't help the smile that crept across her face. Emma was 11, smart as a whip, and the sole reason Sarah dragged herself out of bed every morning and worked shifts that left her feet aching and her back screaming. "Her science fair project is next month, something about plant growth and different types of music." "That's real good, Sarah, real good. You're raising a fine girl there." "Thanks, Walt." She moved down the bar, checking on the other. Customers. A couple on what looked like a first date. Awkward and earnest. 2 construction workers still in their dusty work clothes, decompressing after a long day. A businessman in a rumpled suit who'd loosened his tie and was working through what looked like his 3rd whiskey. The door opened with a gust of cold October air and the tinkle of the bell that hung above it. Sarah glanced up automatically, her bartender's instinct cataloging the newcomers before she'd even consciously registered them. 3 men, mid-20s, wearing expensive athletic gear, the kind of designer hoodies and pristine sneakers that cost more than Sarah made in a week. They moved with a certain swagger, a looseness that came from people who'd never been told no, never learned that the world didn't revolve around their desires. Sarah's internal warning system, honed over years of managing drunk people and reading situations before they escalated, pinged quietly. Nothing concrete, just a feeling. She kept her expression neutral and welcoming as they approached the bar. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" she asked. The tallest one, with bleached blonde hair styled in an elaborate fade, looked around the bar with barely concealed disdain. "This place serve anything besides domestic piss?" Sarah kept her smile professional. We've got a selection of craft beers on tap, some imports in bottles. I can run through what we have if you'd like. Yeah, whatever. Give me an IPA. Make it a good one. He didn't say, please, didn't make eye contact, just pulled out his phone and started scrolling. His two friends ordered similar drinks with similar attitudes, and Sarah poured them without comment. She'd dealt with worse. The key was to stay pleasant, stay professional, and not let them see that their rudeness landed. People like this, they fed on reactions. Starve them of that, and usually they got bored and left. The three newcomers took their beers to a high-top table near the middle of the bar, and Sarah returned her attention to her regulars. The basketball game on TV went to commercial, and in the relative quiet, she could hear the newcomers' conversation. Loud, punctuated with crude jokes and casual profanity that made the couple on their first date shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah? Walt's voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made her look up sharply. He was staring down at his beer, his jaw tight. I think I'm gonna head out. She glanced over at the three young men, then back to Walt. Don't let them run you off, Walt. You were here first. Nah, it's fine. I'm tired anyway. But he wasn't fine, and they both knew it. He was withdrawing, retreating from conflict the way he'd learned to do as an old man living alone in a world that often felt hostile to his generation, his experiences, his very existence. It broke Sarah's heart a little, the way people like Walt made themselves smaller to avoid confrontation. Walt finished his beer and stood slowly, his movements careful as he negotiated his way off the bar stool. His cane, a simple wooden one, was propped against the bar. He reached for it, grasped it, and started making his way toward the door, shuffling with the careful steps of someone whose body hurt more days than not. He made it maybe 10 feet before one of the three young men, not the blonde one, but a shorter guy with an expensive watch glinting on his wrist, stuck his foot out into the aisle. Sarah saw it happen in slow motion, the way tragedy always seems to unfold. Walt's cane caught on the extended foot. He stumbled, his balance already precarious, his reflexes no longer quick enough to save himself. He went down hard, his shoulder hitting the floor with a sickening thud, his cane clattering away across the wooden planks. The sound of Walt's body hitting the ground seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the bar. Everyone froze. Then the three young men erupted in laughter, cruel, delighted laughter that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Shit! Did you see that? The one who'd tripped him said, his voice carrying over Walt's quiet groan of pain. Old man went down like a sack of bricks. That's what you get for walking so fucking slow, the blonde one added, raising his phone to film Walt's prone form. Something inside Sarah snapped. She'd spent 6 years being professional, being accommodating, swallowing her pride and her anger to keep her job and keep the tips flowing. She'd smiled through harassment, through condescension, through entitled customers who treated her like she was beneath their notice. She'd done it for Emma, for the paycheck, for survival. But watching Walt, kind, gentle Walt, who'd served his country and fought in jungles half a world away, and carried scars both visible and invisible, lying on the floor while these spoiled children laughed at him, something fundamental shifted. Sarah vaulted over the bar. She'd never done it before, not in 6 years, but her body moved without conscious thought. Her palm hit the polished wood, her legs swung over, and then she was striding across the floor with fury radiating from every line of her body. Get up, she said to the one who'd tripped Walt. Her voice was low, deadly calm. He looked up at her, still laughing. What? I said get up. Sarah was 5'6", maybe 140 pounds, but in that moment she felt 10 feet tall. You're going to apologize to him, and then you're going to get the hell out of my bar." The blonde one stood, positioning himself between Sarah and his friend. "Your bar? You're a fucking bartender, sweetheart. You don't own shit." "I don't care." Sarah's hands were trembling, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from rage carefully controlled. "You tripped an elderly veteran, you filmed him on the ground, and you laughed about it. You're done here." Behind her, she was dimly aware of other people moving. The construction workers standing up, the businessman setting down, his drink, even the young couple shifting as if ready to intervene. But Sarah's entire focus was on these three men, and on Walt, who was trying to push himself up from the floor, his face pale with pain and humiliation. "Why don't you calm down?" the third one said, his tone mocking. "It was just a joke. The old guy's fine." "Does he look fine to you?" Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. She turned slightly, addressing the room. "Someone help him up, carefully." One of the construction workers, a broad-shouldered man named Mike, who'd been coming to O'Malley's for years, moved past Sarah and knelt beside Walt, offering a hand. "Easy, buddy. We got you." The blonde one pulled out his phone, raising it to film Sarah. "This is great. Crazy bartender freaking out. This is going to get so many views." And that's when Sarah made the choice that would change everything. She reached out and knocked the phone from his hand. It clattered to the floor, the screen cracking with a sound like breaking ice. For a moment, everyone froze. The blonde one stared at his shattered phone, his face going red, and Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "You fucking bitch," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea how much that cost?" "Less than your humanity, apparently." Sarah stood her ground, even as he stepped closer, invading her space, using his height to intimidate. "You're gonna pay for that," he said. "I'm gonna sue you, get you fired, make sure you never work in this city again." "Then you better get started," Sarah said. "Because you're leaving, now." For a moment, she thought he might swing at her. His fist clenched, his jaw tight, and Sarah prepared herself for the blow. She'd been hit before, once by a drunk customer who'd grabbed a handful of her hair and gotten in a glancing strike before security threw him out. She knew it would hurt, knew it might cost her this job she desperately needed, but she also knew with absolute certainty that she would not back down. But the blow never came. Mike appeared at Sarah's shoulder, all 6'3" and 240 of him, his expression making clear that if anyone took a swing, they'd have to deal with him. The other construction worker flanked her on the opposite side. Even the businessman in the rumpled suit had stood up, his posture protective. The three young men looked around at the bar full of people who'd united against them, and whatever bravado they'd come in with started to crack. "This place is a shithole anyway," the blonde one said. He bent down and scooped up his broken phone, cradling it like a wounded animal. "Come on, let's go somewhere that doesn't smell like failure." They left, finally, pushing through the door with exaggerated disgust, their voices carrying back insults and threats that gradually faded as they moved down the street. Sarah stood in the middle of the bar, her whole body shaking now that the adrenaline was starting to ebb. She turned to Walt, whom Mike and the other construction worker had helped into a chair. "Are you okay? Did you hit your head?" "I'm all right," Walt said, but his hands were trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. "Just my pride that's hurt mostly. And my shoulder. That's going to be sore tomorrow." "You should let me call an ambulance, get you checked out." No, can't afford that." Walt shook his head firmly. "I'll be fine, Sarah. But thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. "Nobody treats you like that. Not while I'm around." Mike clapped her on the shoulder. That was something else, Sarah. Reminded me of my drill sergeant back in the Marines. She managed a weak laugh. Yeah, well, I probably just got myself fired. O'Malley would be a fool, Mike said. But if he gives you any trouble, you let us know. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The other customers stayed protectively close, as if their presence could shield Sarah from whatever consequences might be coming. Walt insisted he was fine, but Sarah kept checking on him, bringing him water and a fresh beer on the house, watching for signs of concussion or shock. When her shift ended at 11, she clocked out with a sense of foreboding. Her manager hadn't been there to witness what happened, but she knew the story would reach him. The question was whether she'd still have a job tomorrow, or whether standing up for Walt would cost her the livelihood she and Emma depended on. She drove home through empty streets, her hands still slightly unsteady on the wheel. Her apartment was dark, except for the glow of a nightlight from Emma's room. The babysitter, a high school student from downstairs, was asleep on the couch and startled awake when Sarah came in. "Everything okay?" the girl asked, rubbing her eyes. "Yeah, fine. Emma go to bed on time?" "Yep. Finished her homework, had a snack. Lights out by 9:30. Sarah paid her and watched her shuffle out, then locked the door behind her and stood in her quiet living room, looking at the space she'd created for her daughter. It wasn't much: second-hand furniture, walls that needed painting, carpet that was wearing thin. But it was theirs. She'd fought for every inch of this small, shabby apartment, every meal on their table, every piece of stability in Emma's life. And tonight, she might have jeopardized all of it. Sarah checked on Emma, asleep with a book on her chest, her dark hair spread across the pillow, then went to her own room and lay down without bothering to change clothes. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, it was restless and filled with anxiety. The next morning, Wednesday, Sarah woke to her alarm with a sense of dread. She made Emma breakfast, packed her lunch, walked her to the school bus stop. The same routine as always, except nothing felt routine anymore. Everything felt precarious, balanced on the edge of disaster. Her phone rang as she was drinking her second cup of coffee, trying to gather the energy to face whatever was coming. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Is this Sarah Mitchell?" A man's voice, formal, professional. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is James O'Malley, ma'am. I own O'Malley's bar where you work." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Mr. O'Malley, look, about last night." "I heard what happened," he interrupted. "Heard you stood up for Walt Fisher. Heard you threw out some punks who were making trouble." "I also broke one of their phones," Sarah said, figuring honesty was the only policy left to her. "He might press charges or sue or—" "Good," O'Malley said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. "Should have done more than that. Walt Fisher drinks at my bar because 30 years ago he pulled my father out of a house fire, carried him out on his back while his own clothes were burning. My old man lived another 20 years because of Walt." Sarah sat down slowly at her kitchen table, her legs suddenly weak. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't. Walt doesn't talk about it, but the Mitchell family doesn't forget." There was a pause. "I'm calling to tell you your job is safe, Sarah. More than safe. I'm giving you a raise, $2 an hour, and I'm putting you on the schedule for whatever shifts you want. You need more hours, you got 'em. You need different hours, say the word." "Mr. O'Malley, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep doing what you did last night, looking after the people who need it. That's the kind of person I want working in my establishment." They talked for a few more minutes, and by the time Sarah hung up, she was crying. Great, gulping sobs of relief that she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. She wasn't fired. She was getting a raise. Emma's lunch fees would be paid, the check engine light could be addressed. Maybe they could even afford to do something special for her daughter's birthday next month. The universe had, for once, rewarded her for doing the right thing. Sarah went about her day with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. She ran errands, cleaned the apartment, picked Emma up from school, and actually had the energy to help with homework without feeling like she was running on fumes. When she went in for her evening shift, she was greeted like a hero. Mike and his friend high-fived her. Other regulars bought her drinks, which she had to politely refuse while working, and Walt showed up with a bruised shoulder, but a huge smile. "You're the talk of the neighborhood," he told her. "Heard O'Malley gave you a raise." Word travels fast. It's a small community, Sarah. We take care of our own. Walt settled onto his usual bar stool. "How about a beer for an old man who's feeling grateful?" She poured him his Sam Adams with a smile. "On the house tonight, Walt." The evening passed smoothly, and Sarah went home feeling better than she had in years. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, the sleep of someone whose conscience was clear and whose immediate future was, for once, secure. Thursday morning, 24 hours after the incident at the bar, Sarah was making breakfast for Emma when she heard it. At first, she thought it was thunder, a low, rolling rumble that seemed to vibrate through the walls of her apartment. But the sky outside her window was clear, the October morning bright and cold. The rumble grew louder, resolving into something more mechanical. Engines. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. "Mom, what's that noise?" Emma looked up from her cereal, her eyes wide. "I don't know, sweetie." Sarah moved to the window and looked down at the street 3 stories below. Motorcycles. The street was filling with motorcycles. Big ones, Harleys and Indians and custom choppers, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. They came in formation, riding in staggered pairs, their engines creating a symphony of thunder that made the windows rattle. Sarah watched in disbelief as they kept coming, turning onto her street from both directions, parking in precise rows along both sides of the road. Men and women dismounted, all wearing leather jackets, many with patches and insignia Sarah didn't recognize. They moved with military precision, forming up on the sidewalk, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that they were looking up at her building. "Emma, get your backpack," Sarah said, her voice tight. "We need to go." "But Mom, now, honey, please." Sarah's mind was racing. Had those 3 men from the bar sent these people? Was this retaliation? But that didn't make sense. They'd been spoiled rich kids, not the type to have connections to a biker gang. Still, she grabbed her phone, ready to call 911 if necessary, and ushered Emma toward the door. They made it down the stairs to the building's entrance, and Sarah pushed open the door with Emma's hand tight in hers, ready to run if needed. The bikers had formed 2 lines on the sidewalk, creating a corridor from her building to the street. There had to be 200 of them at least, maybe more, standing at attention with military bearing. They wore leather vests over their jackets, and now Sarah could see the patches clearly. Many had military insignia, unit numbers, ranks, Vietnam veterans, Gulf War veterans, Iraq, Afghanistan, Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force. At the front of this assembly stood an older man, maybe 65, with steel gray hair and a weathered face. He wore a leather vest covered in patches and pins, and despite his age, he stood ramrod straight, his bearing unmistakably military. "Sarah Mitchell," he called out. She stepped forward, keeping Emma slightly behind her. "That's me. What's this about?" The man smiled, and it transformed his stern face into something warm and grandfatherly. "Ma'am, my name is Tom Bradley. I'm the president of the Pacific Northwest Veterans Motorcycle Club," Hitsuohan gestured to the assembled bikers. "These are my brothers and sisters. We heard about what you did for Walt Fisher." Sarah blinked, confused. How did you hear about that?" "Walt's nephew called me yesterday. See, Walt served in my unit in Vietnam. He saved my life in '68, carried me through a rice paddy under fire when I took shrapnel to my leg. He was 19 years old, and he could have left me there and saved himself. But he didn't." Tom's voice roughened with emotion. "I've owed Walt Fisher for 57 years. So when I heard that some punks hurt him, disrespected him, and that you stood up for him, put your own job on the line for him, I knew we needed to come here." "I don't understand," Sarah said slowly. "We take care of our own," Tom said simply. "And anyone who takes care of our own is our own. Walt told his nephew that you're struggling, working 2 jobs trying to raise your daughter. He told us about the integrity you showed, the courage." Tom looked around at the assembled bikers. "How many of us have walked into places and been looked at like we don't belong? How many times have people treated us like relics, like jokes, like we're invisible?" A rumble of agreement moved through the crowd. "You treated Walt with respect," Tom continued. "You defended him when he couldn't defend himself. You put yourself at risk for someone who society often forgets." He reached into his vest and pulled out an envelope. "Ma'am, we took up a collection. Every member of our club contributed. We've also established a fund for Walt's medical expenses, but he insisted that the bulk of what we raised should go to you." Sarah took the envelope with shaking hands. She opened it and saw a check made out to her name. The amount made her knees weak. $50,000. "I can't," she whispered. "This is too much. I just did what anyone should—" "But most people don't," Tom interrupted gently. "Most people look the other way. Most people decide it's not their problem. You didn't do that." He gestured to the bikers assembled behind him. "Every person here is a veteran. We've all served, all sacrificed, and we've all experienced what it's like when society moves on without us. What you did for Walt, that wasn't nothing. That was everything." Sarah looked at the check again, then at her daughter, who was staring up at her with wide eyes, and then at the sea of weathered, proud faces watching her with expressions of respect and gratitude. These were men and women who'd seen combat, who'd survived wars, who'd come home to a country that often didn't appreciate what they'd given. And they were here for her because she'd defended one of their own. "I don't know what to say," Sarah managed, her voice breaking. "Say you'll accept it," Tom said. "Say you'll take care of yourself and your daughter. Say you'll remember that doing the right thing matters, that standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves matters." Behind Tom, a figure pushed, through the crowd. Walt Fisher, looking small and frail compared to these bikers, but beaming with pride. "Sarah, these are my people, my brothers and sisters. They wanted to meet you, wanted to thank you proper." Sarah was crying now, unable to stop the tears streaming down her face. Emma pressed against her side, wrapping small arms around her waist. "Thank you," Sarah said, and her voice carried down the corridor of veterans. "Thank you so much." What happened next was something Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Tom Bradley snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. Behind him, 200 bikers did the same, their movements synchronized, their respect evident. They held the salute for a long moment, a gesture of honor, of recognition, of gratitude. Then Tom lowered his hand and smiled. "We also wanted to let you know, you need anything at all, you call me." He handed her a card with his number. "Car breaks down? We'll fix it. Emma needs help with school? We've got teachers, professors, tutors in our ranks. Someone gives you trouble? We'll be there. Your family now, Walt added, his voice thick with emotion. That's what this means. You're part of something bigger. Sarah hugged Walt carefully, mindful of his bruised shoulder, and then found herself shaking hands with what felt like 100 veterans, each one thanking her, each one making her feel like she'd done something extraordinary when all she'd felt was fury at injustice. A woman about Sarah's age, with kind eyes and a Marine Corps insignia on her vest, knelt down to Emma's level. Your mom's a real hero, you know that? Emma looked up at Sarah with something like awe. I know. The impromptu gathering lasted for 20 minutes, with bikers introducing themselves, sharing stories, taking photos. Someone handed Sarah a leather vest with patches, an honorary member of the Veterans Motorcycle Club, they said. Someone else gave Emma a stuffed eagle, wearing a tiny military uniform, which made her laugh with delight. Finally, as neighbors began coming out of their buildings to watch the spectacle, Tom Bradley raised his hand for quiet. We've taken enough of your morning, ma'am, but we wanted you to know. You did good. You represented the best of what civilians can be. You honored one of our brothers, and we don't forget that. He turned to the assembled bikers. Mount up! The veterans moved with practiced efficiency, returning to their motorcycles. Emma watched in fascination as they kicked engines to life, the thunder returning to shake the street. They departed the same way they'd arrived, in formation, with precision and pride, leaving Sarah standing on the sidewalk with a check that would change her life, and the profound understanding that her moment of courage had rippled out in ways she never could have anticipated. That evening, Sarah called in to O'Malley's and asked for the night off. Tom had given her his blessing to miss work, and for once, she wanted to spend an evening with Emma, to let what had happened sink in, to begin imagining a future that wasn't defined by constant financial stress. They ordered pizza, the good kind from the fancy place that Emma loved, but they almost never could afford. They sat on the couch together, watching movies, Emma's head on Sarah's shoulder, the stuffed eagle clutched in her arms. Mom, Emma said during a commercial, why did all those people come today? Sarah considered how to explain it in terms an 11-year-old would understand. There was an old man who needed help, and I helped him. And those people today, they wanted to say thank you because that old man is important to them. Because he was in the war? Partly, but also because he's a good person, and good people look after each other. Emma was quiet for a moment. Are we going to be okay now? With the money? Sarah's heart broke a little that her daughter had been aware of their struggles, had been carrying that worry. Yes, sweetie, we're going to be okay. We can pay off the car and catch up on bills and maybe even take a vacation. Really? Emma's face lit up. Can we go to the beach? We can go to the beach. They went back to the movie, but Sarah's mind was elsewhere, processing everything that had happened. 48 hours ago, she'd been one missed paycheck away from disaster. Now she had financial security, a community of support, and the knowledge that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, doing the right thing led to outcomes that felt like miracles. Her phone buzzed with a text from Walt. Thank you again, Sarah. You gave an old man his dignity back. That's worth more than you know. She texted back, You deserve all the dignity in the world, Walt. Thank you for bringing your family into my life. Because that's what they were now. Family. Not by blood, but by choice and honor, and the bonds that form between people who stand up for each other. Friday morning, Sarah returned to O'Malley's for her shift. Word had spread even further, and the bar was busier than usual with people who wanted to meet the bartender who'd defended a veteran and been honored by 200 bikers. Sarah handled the attention with as much grace as she could muster, deflecting praise and insisting she'd only done what was right. Walt was there, of course, in his usual spot, and throughout the evening various members of the Veterans Motorcycle Club stopped by in ones and twos to say hello, to check on her, to reinforce that the offer of support had been genuine. Tom Bradley came by around 8, ordering a Coke since he was riding. He sat at the bar and watched Sarah work with an approving expression. "You're handling all this attention well." "I'm a bartender," Sarah said with a slight smile. "I'm used to performing." "It's more than performance, though, isn't it?" Tom studied her with eyes that had seen too much in his lifetime to be fooled by facades. "You're genuinely uncomfortable with being called a hero." "I'm not a hero. I just got angry watching someone get hurt." "That's what heroes are," Tom said quietly. "People who get angry at injustice and do something about it, even when it costs them. Especially when it costs them." Sarah wiped down the bar, not sure how to respond. Tom let the silence sit comfortably between them, then changed the subject. "Walt tells me your daughter wants to be a doctor. A veterinarian, actually. She loves animals." "That's a long road. Expensive." "I know." Sarah had run the numbers 1,000 times, had looked at student loans and scholarship requirements, and felt the impossibility of it all. "But she's smart enough. If she keeps her grades up, if she gets scholarships, if we can save enough." If, Tom nodded. "Listen, we've got members who work in veterinary medicine, in academics. When Emma gets to college age, you let me know. We'll make sure she's got mentors, maybe internship opportunities. We take care of family, Sarah. That includes helping the next generation. You've already done so much, and we'll keep doing more, because that's what community means." Tom finished his Coke and stood. "I need to head out, but I'll be back. And Sarah? What you did took real courage. Don't diminish that." He left, and Sarah stood behind her bar feeling overwhelmed and grateful, and still slightly stunned that her life had changed so dramatically in just 48 hours. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to Sarah's life. She paid off her car, caught up on all her bills, and put the majority of the money into savings and investments for Emma's future. She kept working at O'Malley's, partly because she enjoyed it, partly because she wanted Emma to see that financial security didn't mean abandoning work ethic or community. The Veterans Motorcycle Club became a presence in her life, in ways both large and small. When her car needed new brakes, 2 veterans showed up at her apartment with tools and did the work for free. When Emma's science fair came around, a retired biology professor from the club spent an afternoon helping her refine her project. When Sarah mentioned wanting to take Emma to the coast, a member who owned a beach house offered to let them stay there for free. It wasn't charity, it was family. That's what Tom had promised, and that's what it turned out to be. Sarah found herself attending club events, barbecues where veterans and their families gathered to share meals and stories. Emma made friends with other children in the community, and Sarah made friends with women who understood what it meant to work hard, to sacrifice, to value loyalty and honor. Walt remained a fixture in her life and at the bar, and their friendship deepened into something that felt like family. He was the grandfather Emma had never known, the steady presence that reminded Sarah that there were still good people in the world, that kindness and courage mattered. 3 months after the incident at the bar, Sarah attended her first Veterans Motorcycle Club meeting as an honorary member. Tom Bradley introduced her to the group, telling the story of what she'd done, and Sarah stood before a room full of veterans, people who'd seen and survived things she couldn't imagine, and felt their respect and acceptance wash over her like a benediction. "What Sarah did," Tom said to the assembled club, "represents the best of what we fight for. We serve to protect people who'll stand up for what's right, who'll defend those who can't defend themselves, who'll look at injustice and refuse to turn away. She's one of us now, and we're better for having her." The room erupted in applause, and Sarah found herself crying again. But these were different tears than she'd cried in fear and desperation over unpaid bills. These were tears of belonging, of purpose, of understanding that her life had intersected with something larger than herself. On the 6-month anniversary of that October evening when she'd vaulted over the bar to defend Walt, Sarah took Emma to the beach. They stayed in the house that had been offered to them, spent 3 days walking on sand and collecting shells and watching the Pacific Ocean crash against the shore in its eternal rhythm. On the last evening, as the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples, Emma looked up at her mother and said, "Mom, I'm glad you helped Mr. Walt." "Me too, sweetie. Even if all those bikers hadn't come, I'd still be glad." Sarah pulled her daughter close, understanding that Emma had learned the most important lesson Sarah could teach her: that you do the right thing because it's right, not because of what you might get out of it. The rewards, if they come, are secondary to the act itself. But sometimes, Sarah thought as she watched the sun sink below the horizon, sometimes the universe does reward courage. Sometimes standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves leads to connections and community that change everything. Sometimes doing the right thing opens doors you didn't even know existed. "I'm glad too," Sarah said, kissing the top of Emma's head. "For so many reasons." They stayed on the beach until the stars came out, until the air grew cold enough that Emma shivered, and they retreated to the warmth of the house. That night, Sarah lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the ocean, and thinking about how far she'd come from that moment of fury and protective instinct. She'd defended an old veteran because it was the right thing to do. She hadn't known about his connection to the bar owner, hadn't known about his place in a brotherhood of veterans, hadn't known that her moment of courage would ripple outward in ways that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life and Emma's future. But even if none of that had happened, even if she'd been fired, even if there had been no bikers on her street, no check, no community of support, she would do it again. That knowledge settled in her chest with the weight of truth. She was the kind of person who couldn't watch someone suffer and do nothing. It was part of her core identity, as fundamental as her love for Emma or her need to breathe. The universe had rewarded that trait this time. But Sarah knew there would be other times, other moments when doing the right thing would cost her rather than reward her. And she would do it anyway. That was what Tom Bradley had recognized in her. That was why the veterans had claimed her as family. Not because she'd defended Walt once, but because she was the kind of person who would defend him every time, regardless of consequence. Back in Portland, life continued with its new normal. Sarah's shifts at O'Malley's became something she looked forward to, rather than endured. The bar had become known in the neighborhood as a place where veterans were respected, where troublemakers weren't tolerated, where a working-class bartender had stood up for what was right and been honored for it. New customers came specifically because of that reputation. Some were veterans themselves, seeking a place where they'd be welcomed and valued. Others were civilians who wanted to support a business that embodied those values. O'Malley's thrived, and Mr. O'Malley gave Sarah another raise and promoted her to bar manager, trusting her to handle the evening shifts and maintain the culture that had developed. Walt's health improved with better medical care. The fund the Veterans Motorcycle Club had established for him covered regular doctor visits, physical therapy for his shoulder, and medications that he'd been rationing before. He moved with less pain, laughed more easily, and seemed to shed years from his weathered face. He still came to the bar almost every evening, but now he brought other veterans with him, men and women who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of the community. The 3 young men who'd tripped Walt were never seen again in O'Malley's or anywhere else in the neighborhood. Sarah heard through the grapevine that they'd tried to file a complaint about her breaking the phone, but the bar's security footage, grainy but clear enough, showed them tripping Walt and laughing. The complaint went nowhere, and the story of what they'd done spread through social media in ways that made them minor pariahs in certain circles. Sarah didn't take pleasure in their discomfort, but she didn't lose sleep over it either. Actions had consequences, and they'd learned that the hard way. Tom Bradley became a regular fixture in Sarah's life, checking in weekly, sometimes stopping by the bar, sometimes calling just to see how things were going. He and Walt had been reunited after decades of minimal contact, and watching the 2 of them together, 2 old soldiers who'd survived hell and come out the other side, reminded Sarah of why she'd acted in the first place. These were people with stories, with valor, with humanity that deserved respect. "I've been thinking," Tom said one evening in January, almost 3 months after the bikers had appeared on Sarah's street. He was sitting at the bar, nursing his usual Coke, Walt beside him with his Sam Adams. "We want to do something more formal. An award, maybe a ceremony. Recognize what you did publicly." Sarah shook her head immediately. "Tom, no. I appreciate it, but I don't want that kind of attention." "It's not about attention," Walt said quietly. "It's about showing other people what courage looks like. It's about inspiring them to do the same thing." "I'm just a bartender who got angry," Sarah protested. "I'm not someone who should be held up as an example." "You're exactly someone who should be held up as an example," Tom countered. "You're a working mother who put herself at risk to defend someone who couldn't defend himself. You're someone who saw injustice and refused to accept it. That's not just anything, Sarah. That's extraordinary." They went back and forth, but eventually Sarah agreed to a small ceremony. Nothing huge, just the Veterans Motorcycle Club and some local press. It felt uncomfortable accepting so much recognition for what had seemed like a basic human response to cruelty, but she understood that for Tom and Walt and the others, this was about more than her. It was about making a statement that veterans mattered, that standing up for them mattered, that communities should protect their own. The ceremony took place in late January at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall, a squat brick building that had stood in the neighborhood for 60 years. Sarah dressed in simple slacks and a blouse, feeling out of place among the formal military dress uniforms and leather vests covered in patches. Emma came with her, wearing her nicest dress, excited and nervous in equal measure. The hall was packed, not just members of the Veterans Motorcycle Club, but veterans from all over the city, people who'd heard the story and wanted to be present for this recognition. Sarah stood on a small stage, feeling exposed and uncomfortable, while Tom Bradley spoke about what she'd done, about the courage it represented, about the example she'd set. "In a world where people often look the other way," Tom said, his voice carrying through the hall. Sarah Mitchell looked directly at injustice and said, "Not on my watch." She put herself at risk, her job, her safety, her livelihood, to defend a man who'd served his country with honor. She saw Walter Fisher not as an old man who'd gotten in the way, not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a human being who deserved dignity and respect. Tom paused, looking out at the assembled veterans. We've all experienced moments where society has made us feel invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. We've all walked into places and been dismissed, patronized, or ignored. What Sarah did was remind us that we matter, that our service matters, that there are still people who will stand up for us the way we once stood up for them. He turned to Sarah, and his eyes were bright with emotion. Ma'am, on behalf of the Pacific Northwest Veterans Motorcycle Club and the broader veteran community, we want to present you with the Civilian Service Medal, our highest honor for a non-veteran who has demonstrated extraordinary courage and commitment to those who've served. Sarah accepted the medal, a heavy piece of bronze hanging from a red, white, and blue ribbon, and felt the weight of it in her hands. It was beautiful, engraved with an eagle and the words courage, honor, service. But more than the physical object, she felt the weight of what it represented. The trust and respect of people who'd sacrificed for their country, who knew the true cost of courage. Thank you, she managed, her voice cracking. I don't feel like I deserve this, but I'm honored to accept it. Walt, she looked out into the audience where he sat in the front row, beaming with pride. You deserved to be defended. Every veteran in this room deserves to be defended. You gave so much for all of us, and the least we can do is stand up for you when you need it. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I have a daughter, Emma. She gestured to where Emma sat beside an empty chair. I want her to grow up in a world where people don't look away from injustice, where standing up for what's right is normal, not exceptional. If my moment of anger in a bar can inspire even one person to do the same thing, to defend someone who needs defending, then maybe this recognition serves a purpose beyond making me uncomfortable. The hall erupted in applause and laughter at her self-deprecating comment. Sarah stepped down from the stage, and what followed was an hour of veterans coming up to shake her hand, to thank her, to share their own stories of times they'd felt dismissed or disrespected. Each story reinforced why this mattered, why Tom had been right to push for recognition despite her discomfort. Emma was surrounded by veterans who wanted to meet her, to tell her how proud she should be of her mother, to give her pins and patches and challenge coins, military tradition of honoring someone by giving them a commemorative coin. By the end of the evening, Emma had collected 23 coins, each one representing a connection to a veteran who wanted her to remember them and what they'd stood for. The local news covered the ceremony, and the story spread beyond Portland. Sarah gave one interview, reluctantly, where she tried to redirect attention back to veterans' issues, to the fact that too many were struggling with homelessness, healthcare access, and recognition. The interviewer seemed frustrated that she wouldn't play the role of humble hero, but Sarah was adamant. This wasn't about her. It was about a larger issue of how society treated its veterans. In the weeks that followed, Sarah received letters from around the country, veterans thanking her, civilians telling her she'd inspired them. Even a few letters from other service industry workers who'd had similar experiences and wanted to share their stories. She tried to respond to as many as possible, though it quickly became overwhelming. You've become a symbol, Tom told her one evening at the bar, whether you wanted to or not. I just want to go back to pouring beers and living my life, Sarah said, though there was no real complaint in her voice. She understood what had happened, understood that her story had touched something deeper in the cultural consciousness. A hunger for examples of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, for evidence that courage and integrity still existed. You can do both, Tom assured her. Pour beers, live your life, and be an example. They're not mutually exclusive. By spring, life had settled into a new equilibrium. The initial frenzy of attention had died down, though Sarah still received occasional letters, and the Civilian Service Medal hung in a place of honor in her apartment. She'd framed it and mounted it on the wall where she could see it every morning. Not out of pride, but as a reminder of the community she'd become part of, the responsibilities that came with that membership. Emma thrived with the stability that financial security provided. Her grades improved even more, and she became involved in volunteering at a local animal shelter, an opportunity that came through connections with the Veterans Motorcycle Club. She spent Saturday mornings caring for abandoned dogs and cats, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian solidified from a childhood fantasy into a genuine goal with a path forward. Sarah used some of the money the veterans had given her to create a small emergency fund for other O'Malley's regulars who hit hard times. She did it quietly, without fanfare, paying someone's electric bill when they were about to be shut off, covering a prescription someone couldn't afford, slipping extra money into the tip jar when she knew a regular was struggling. It felt right, this circulation of generosity, this paying forward of the grace she'd received. Walt's nephew, who'd first called Tom Bradley and set everything in motion, became part of Sarah's extended circle. He was a lawyer in his 40s who'd always been close to his uncle, but hadn't realized how isolated Walt had become. The incident at the bar had been a wake-up call, and he'd made efforts to be more present in Walt's life. He and Sarah became friends, bonding over their shared commitment to ensuring Walt's remaining years were filled with dignity and community. "I should have been there," he told Sarah once, guilt evident in his voice. "I should have been checking in more, making sure he was okay." "You're here now," Sarah said simply. "That's what matters." One Saturday in April, the Veterans Motorcycle Club organized a ride to raise money for veteran mental health services. They invited Sarah to ride along, not on a motorcycle, since she didn't have her license, but in a support vehicle that would follow the route. Emma came too, and they spent the day as part of a convoy of 100 motorcycles winding through the Columbia River Gorge, the spring landscape bursting with green and wildflowers. At the end point, a park where they'd set up a barbecue and fundraising event, Sarah watched Emma playing with other children while veterans and their families gathered to eat and share stories. This was the community she'd accidentally become part of. These were the people who'd claimed her as family. Not because of blood, not because of service in uniform, but because of a moment of courage that had revealed her character. Tom Bradley found her standing slightly apart from the crowd, observing with the natural tendency of bartenders to watch rather than participate. "You look thoughtful," he said. "Just taking it all in," Sarah replied. 6 months ago, I was one missed paycheck away from eviction. Now I'm here, surrounded by all of you, watching my daughter laugh without that constant background fear of not being able to provide for her." "You provided for her before," Tom pointed out. "That hasn't changed." "No, but the desperation has. The constant calculation of whether we could afford this or that. The fear that one emergency would topple everything." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not naive enough to think money solves everything, but it solves a lot." "It's not just the money, though," Tom said. "It's the community. The knowing that if something does happen, you're not alone." "No," Sarah agreed. "I'm not alone anymore." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the gathering. A group of older veterans were teaching some of the children how to properly fold an American flag, the movements precise and ceremonial. Emma was among them, her face serious with concentration as she learned the proper technique. "She's going to do great things," Tom observed. "You're raising a good kid." "I'm trying," Sarah said. "It's easier when I have help, though. When she has examples beyond just me." "That's what this is all about," Tom gestured to the crowd. "Nobody makes it alone. We all need our unit, our squad, our people. You've got that now." The fundraiser was a success, raising over $30,000 for mental health services. Sarah contributed what she could and helped organize the silent auction that made up part of the event. At the end of the day, as they were packing up, a young veteran approached her, maybe 25, with a prosthetic leg visible below his shorts and a haunted look in his eyes that spoke of battles both foreign and internal. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did for that old guy in the bar." "You're welcome," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking her for. "I was having a really bad day when I saw your story on the news," he continued. "Real bad. The kind where you start thinking maybe things would be easier if you weren't around anymore." He took a shaky breath. "But then I saw your interview, where you said that veterans deserved to be defended, that we'd given so much, and the least people could do was stand up for us. And it reminded me that maybe I do matter. Maybe my service counted for something. Maybe I'm worth defending, even from myself." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You absolutely matter. Your service counts for everything, and you are worth defending, especially from yourself." "I called the crisis line that night," he said. "Started seeing a therapist through the VA. I'm doing better now. Still have hard days, but I'm fighting through them. And I wanted you to know that what you did, it had ripples beyond just that one night. You might have saved more than one life." He shook her hand and walked away before Sarah could fully process what he'd said. She stood there feeling the weight of responsibility and purpose, and the profound realization that actions could echo in ways impossible to predict. She'd defended Walt because he was a human being who deserved dignity. She hadn't thought about the symbolic importance, about what that moment of courage might mean to other veterans struggling with their own battles. Tom appeared at her elbow, having witnessed the exchange. "You okay?" "Yeah," Sarah said, wiping at her eyes. "Just understanding something I hadn't fully grasped before." "What's that?" "That courage isn't just about the immediate moment. It's about what that moment represents, what it tells other people about their worth, about whether standing up for what's right still matters in the world." Tom nodded slowly. "Now you're getting it. Now you understand why we made such a big deal about what you did. It wasn't really about you, Sarah. It was about what your actions said to every veteran who's ever felt invisible or forgotten. You reminded them that they matter." Summer came, bringing long days and warm evenings. O'Malley's expanded its outdoor seating, and Sarah often worked the patio area where regulars could enjoy the rare Portland sunshine. Walt held court at his usual table, regaling younger veterans with stories from Vietnam, his voice stronger and more animated than it had been in years. The three men who'd tripped him never returned, but their absence was noted and appreciated by everyone who frequented the bar. Sarah had heard through mutual acquaintances that they'd moved to a different neighborhood, perhaps seeking places where their behavior would be more tolerated. She didn't wish them ill, but she didn't miss them either. In July, on Emma's 12th birthday, the Veterans Motorcycle Club threw her a party that was both overwhelming and wonderful. Tom Bradley rented out a community center, and it seemed like half the club showed up with presents and well wishes. Emma received books about veterinary medicine, a microscope for examining specimens, gift certificates to the animal shelter, and most impressively, a promise from 3 veterinarians in the club that they'd mentor her through high school and help her navigate the path toward her dream career. "You're giving her too much," Sarah protested to Tom as she watched Emma open present after present, her face glowing with joy and surprise. "We're investing in the next generation," Tom corrected. "Emma's got the grades, the drive, and the heart. She's going to do great things, and we want to be part of making that possible. Besides," he added with a smile, "she's family. This is what family does." Sarah had to step outside for a moment to compose herself, overwhelmed by the generosity and acceptance. She'd spent so many years struggling alone, fighting to give Emma opportunities, that this collective support felt almost surreal. A year ago, she wouldn't have believed this could be her life. Walt found her on the patio, looking out at the summer evening. "You did good, Sarah. Real good." "I got angry and knocked a phone out of someone's hand," Sarah said with a slight laugh. "That's not exactly heroic." "You stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself," Walt corrected gently. "You put yourself at risk without hesitation. You showed courage and integrity when most people would have looked the other way." He paused. "And you gave an old man his dignity back. You made me feel like I still mattered, like my service and my life had value. You have no idea what that means." Sarah turned to look at him, this gentle man who'd carried Tom Bradley through a rice paddy under fire 57 years ago, who'd pulled Mr. O'Malley's father from a burning building, who'd lived a quiet life of service that had gone largely unrecognized until 3 spoiled young men had tried to humiliate him. "You've always mattered, Walt. Always." "I know that now," Walt said. "Thanks to you." They stood together in the warm evening air, listening to the sounds of laughter and celebration from inside, and Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what life should be: community and connection. People supporting each other, courage recognized and rewarded rather than punished. As summer turned to fall and the anniversary of the incident approached, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had transformed. She'd been promoted again at O'Malley's, now managing all shifts and training new bartenders. Her savings had grown substantially, carefully invested with advice from club members who worked in finance. Emma was thriving in school, her path toward veterinary medicine supported by mentors and tutors, and a community that had invested in her success. But more than the material changes, Sarah had found something she hadn't even known she was missing: purpose beyond survival. She'd spent so many years just trying to get by, to keep her and Emma afloat, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself. The Veterans Motorcycle Club became the center of her social life, and through them, she became involved in veteran advocacy work. She testified before the city council about the need for better support services. She helped organize fundraisers for veterans' causes. She spoke at high schools about the importance of respecting and supporting those who'd served. It wasn't work she'd ever imagined doing, but it felt right, like pieces of her life were finally fitting together into a coherent whole. On the 1-year anniversary of defending Walt, O'Malley's hosted a celebration. The bar was packed with veterans and regulars, with people who'd been there that night and people who'd only heard the story. Walt was there, of course, healthier and happier than Sarah had ever seen him. Tom Bradley gave a toast, his voice carrying through the crowded space. "A year ago, Sarah Mitchell did something that seemed small in the moment, but turned out to be monumental. She stood up for one of our brothers. She showed courage and integrity and reminded all of us that there are still people who will fight for what's right, even when it costs them." He raised his glass. To Sarah, for seeing Walt Fisher not as an old man in the way, but as a human being who deserved respect. For standing up when others would have sat down. For being the kind of person we all should strive to be. To Sarah! The crowd echoed, and she felt the familiar prick of tears, the overwhelming gratitude for this community that had claimed her and changed her life. Later, after most people had gone home and only a few regulars remained, Sarah sat at the bar with Walt and Tom, reflecting on the past year. I still can't quite believe this is my life now, she admitted. Believe it, Tom said. You earned it. I just got angry, Sarah protested, though the protest was half-hearted now. She'd heard this argument enough times to know she wouldn't win. You got angry at the right thing, Walt corrected. That's what matters. You saw injustice and you acted. Most people don't. Most people rationalize why it's not their problem, why they shouldn't get involved. You didn't do that. I couldn't do that, Sarah said quietly. I couldn't watch you get hurt and do nothing. It wasn't even a choice. It was just automatic. Instinct. That's what makes it real courage, Tom said. Not the absence of fear, but the inability to do anything other than what's right, even when you're afraid. You were afraid that night, afraid you'd lose your job, afraid of what might happen. But you acted anyway. Sarah nodded slowly, accepting what they were saying. She had been afraid. Terrified, actually. But she'd also been furious, and the fury had overridden the fear, had propelled her over that bar and into a confrontation that could have ended very differently. What would you do if it happened again? Walt asked suddenly. If you saw someone else being hurt or humiliated? Sarah didn't even have to think about it. The same thing. Exactly the same thing. Even knowing it might not turn out well? Tom pressed. Even knowing you might not get lucky with bikers showing up to reward you? Especially then, Sarah said firmly. The reward isn't why you do it. You do it because it's right. Because people matter. Because standing by while someone suffers is its own kind of sin. Walt and Tom exchanged glances, and both smiled. Now you really get it, Tom said. Now you understand why we're all so proud to call you family. Emma started 7th grade that fall, with a confidence Sarah had never possessed at that age. She had her mother's example of standing up for what was right, a community of veterans who'd taken an interest in her success, and a clear path toward her dreams. Sarah watched her daughter navigate school with grace and determination, saw her make friends easily, saw her volunteer at the animal shelter with genuine passion, and felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with her own actions, and everything to do with who Emma was becoming. One evening in late October, Emma came home from school with an assignment for her English class. They were supposed to write about a hero, someone they knew personally who'd shown courage or integrity. Emma had chosen to write about Sarah. Mom, can I interview you? Emma asked, sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook open and a pencil ready. Sarah felt a familiar discomfort at being labeled a hero, but she also recognized an opportunity to teach her daughter something important. Okay, but with one condition. What's that? You also interview some of the veterans we know. Because whatever courage I showed that night, it pales in comparison to what they've done. Real heroism is what they experienced in combat, in survival, in coming home, and rebuilding their lives. Emma considered this, then nodded. Can I write about all of you? Like how you showed courage by defending Mr. Walt, but also how he showed courage by serving in the war, and how Mr. Tom showed courage by coming back from being wounded and building a community? That, Sarah said, smiling, is a much better essay. Yes. Over the next week, Emma conducted interviews with Sarah, Walt, Tom, and several other veterans from the club. She learned stories she'd never heard before, about battles fought and friends lost, about coming home to a country that didn't always welcome them, about the quiet courage it took to keep going when everything felt hopeless. She learned about Tom's shattered leg and his year-long recovery, about Walt carrying wounded comrades under fire, about women who'd served as combat medics and pilots and engineers. When she read her finished essay aloud to Sarah, it was beautiful and heartbreaking and honest. She'd titled it, "A Community of Heroes," and it wove together the story of that night at O'Malley's with the larger context of veterans' experiences, concluding that true heroism was seeing someone who needed help and refusing to look away. The essay earned an A+ and was selected to be read at the school's Veterans Day Assembly. Sarah sat in the audience with Walt and Tom and a dozen other veterans who'd come to support Emma, and listened to her daughter read with clear, confident voice about courage and community and standing up for what's right. After the assembly, several students approached the veterans to shake their hands and thank them for their service. One young boy, maybe 9 years old, looked up at Walt and said, "Mr. Fisher, thank you for protecting our country, and thank you for being Emma's friend." Walt knelt down, carefully, his joints not what they used to be, and looked the boy in the eye. "Thank you for saying that. And you know what? The best way to honor veterans is to stand up for people who need help, just like Emma's mom did for me. Can you do that?" The boy nodded solemnly. "I promise." It was a small moment, easily overlooked, but Sarah saw it as emblematic of everything that had happened over the past year. The ripple effects of one moment of courage, spreading outward to touch lives in ways impossible to measure or predict. Winter came again, bringing cold rain and early darkness. The holiday season approached, and for the first time in years, Sarah didn't feel the familiar anxiety about how to make Christmas special on a tight budget. She could afford gifts for Emma, could afford a real tree instead of the small artificial one they'd used for the past 5 years, could even afford to host a small gathering. She invited Walt and Tom and a handful of other veterans to Christmas dinner, people who might otherwise spend the holiday alone. Her apartment was small, and they had to crowd around her dining table and use mismatched chairs, but it was warm and full of laughter and exactly what Sarah had always imagined the holidays should be. Emma gave Walt a framed photo she'd taken at the Veterans Day Assembly, all the veterans standing together, their faces showing pride and age and hard-earned wisdom. He cried when he opened it, unashamed of the tears that streaked his weathered cheeks. "This is the best gift I've gotten in decades," he said. "Thank you, Emma. Thank you for seeing us, for honoring us, for making this old man feel like he still matters." "You'll always matter to us," Emma said simply, giving him a hug. Sarah watched the scene from her kitchen, overwhelmed with gratitude for this found family, these people who'd entered her life because she'd gotten angry at injustice. This was the real gift, she realized. Not the money, not the medal, not the recognition, but this sense of belonging, of community, of being part of something larger and more important than just her own survival. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Tom pulled Sarah aside. "I have something for you," he said, handing her an envelope. "Tom, you've given me so much already. Just open it." Inside was a deed, a small commercial property on the edge of the neighborhood. Sarah stared at it in confusion. "I don't understand." "The club took a vote," Tom explained. "We want to open a veterans community center, a place where vets can gather, get support services, just hang out and be with people who understand. But we need someone to manage it, someone with integrity and compassion and the ability to make people feel welcome. He smiled. "We want you to run it, Sarah. Full salary, benefits, the whole thing, if you're interested." Sarah's mind reeled. Leave O'Malley's? Take on something this significant? It was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. I need to think about it." "Of course, take your time. The offer stands whenever you're ready." Sarah didn't sleep much that night, her mind churning through possibilities and fears and hopes. Running a veterans center would be meaningful work, would be a way to serve the community that had given her so much. But it would also be a leap into the unknown, leaving the security of a job she knew for something entirely new. In the end, it was Emma who helped her decide. "Mom," she said when Sarah explained the offer, "you should do it. You're always happiest when you're helping people." "I help people at the bar," Sarah protested weakly. "You do," Emma agreed. "But this would be different. This would be your thing, your purpose. And I think you need that." Out of the mouths of 12-year-olds came wisdom Sarah hadn't expected. Emma was right. She needed this, needed a purpose beyond just surviving, needed to channel everything she'd learned over the past year into something that would last beyond single moments of courage. She called Tom the next day and accepted the position. The Veterans Community Center opened in March, 16 months after Sarah had defended Walt in O'Malley's. It was a modest space, 2 large rooms that could be used for gatherings, a small kitchen, a few offices, and a quiet room for veterans who needed a space to decompress or seek counseling. They called it Fisher's Place, in honor of Walt, who cried when they told him. Sarah managed the center with the same competence she'd brought to bartending, but with an added layer of passion that came from truly believing in the work. She organized support groups and job fairs, brought in VA representatives to help with benefits claims, hosted family events and holiday celebrations. The center became a hub for the veteran community, a place where people could come and be understood, where their experiences were validated and their needs were met. She didn't leave O'Malley's entirely. She still picked up occasional shifts, maintaining her connection to the bar that had been the site of her transformative moment. But her primary focus was Fisher's Place, building something that would outlast any single person or event. Emma volunteered at the center after school, helping with administrative tasks and organizing youth programs for veterans' children. She was becoming the kind of person Sarah had always hoped she'd be: compassionate, engaged, committed to making the world better. Walt was a fixture at the center, holding court and sharing stories and providing a living connection to history. Younger veterans sought him out, drawn to his gentle wisdom and the lived experience he represented. He thrived in the environment, his final years filled with purpose and community. Tom Bradley remained the president of the Veterans Motorcycle Club and Sarah's closest confidant in running the center. They worked together to secure funding, to build partnerships with other organizations, to expand services. What had started as Sarah's moment of anger had grown into an institution that served hundreds of veterans and their families. 2 years after the incident at O'Malley's, Sarah was invited to speak at a national veterans conference in Washington, D.C. She'd initially declined. Public speaking still made her uncomfortable, but Tom had insisted, arguing that her story needed to be heard by people who made policy decisions about veteran support. So Sarah found herself standing before an audience of policymakers, veteran service organization representatives, and military leaders, telling the story of what had happened in a Portland bar one October evening. She spoke about Walt's dignity being restored, about the Veterans Motorcycle Club's response, about the community center that had grown from that single moment. "None of this was planned," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I didn't defend Walt Fisher because I wanted recognition or reward. I did it because it was right, because he deserved better, because I couldn't stand by and watch someone suffer. But what happened afterward? The community that claimed me, the opportunities that opened up, the center we built. All of that shows what's possible when people commit to supporting veterans not just with words, but with action." She paused, looking out at the audience. Veterans shouldn't have to rely on the chance that someone will stand up for them. They shouldn't have to hope that their service will be recognized and honored. We should be building systems and communities that ensure every veteran knows they matter, that their sacrifice was meaningful, that they have support when they need it. The speech was met with a standing ovation, but more importantly, it sparked conversations about how to replicate what had happened in Portland in other communities. Sarah found herself consulted by organizations wanting to build similar centers, by communities seeking to strengthen their support for veterans. She was becoming, despite her continued discomfort with the label, a voice for veteran issues, an advocate, and an example. It was work she'd never sought, but work that felt right, that felt like the natural extension of that moment when she'd vaulted over the bar to defend someone who needed defending. 3 years after the incident, on another October evening, Sarah stood in Fisher's Place during the center's anniversary celebration. The space was packed with veterans and their families, with community members who'd supported the center's work, with the Veterans Motorcycle Club members who'd made all of this possible. Walt was there, now 76, moving more slowly but still present, still engaged. Tom Bradley was there, planning the next fundraiser and strategizing about expansion. Emma was there, now 15, and volunteering as a youth counselor, helping younger children of veterans navigate the challenges of having parents who'd served and sometimes struggled with the aftermath. Sarah looked around at what had been built, at the community that had grown from a single moment of protective fury, and felt a profound sense of peace. This was what life was supposed to be, not perfect, not without challenges, but meaningful, connected, full of purpose that extended beyond just survival. A young woman approached her, maybe 22, wearing an army uniform. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Corporal Jessica Torres. I'm deploying to Germany next month, and I wanted to come here before I left." "It's nice to meet you, Jessica. What brings you to Fisher's Place?" "My grandfather is a Vietnam vet," Jessica explained. "He struggled with PTSD for years, kind of withdrew from the world. But he heard about this place, about what you did for Mr. Fisher, and he started coming to the support groups here. It changed his life. He's doing better now than he has in decades." Her eyes were bright with emotion. "So I wanted to thank you for seeing veterans as people who matter, for building something that helps people like my grandfather." "Your grandfather did the hard work," Sarah said gently. "I just helped create a space where that work could happen." "You did more than that," Jessica insisted. "You showed that civilians can be allies, that we're not alone when we come home. That matters more than you know. It's why I feel okay about deploying, because I know there are people like you who'll look out for my family, who'll make sure they're supported." After Jessica left, Sarah found herself thinking about Ripples again. That young woman was deploying with the peace of mind that her grandfather would be cared for. Her grandfather was healing because of a community center that existed because veterans had rallied around a bartender who'd defended one of their own. And that defense had happened because Sarah couldn't watch someone suffer without acting. How many lives had been touched? How many connections made? How many people had been helped because of one moment of courage? It was impossible to quantify, impossible to fully comprehend. But Sarah was beginning to understand that this was how change happened. Not through grand gestures or perfect plans, but through individuals choosing to act when action was needed, through communities rallying to support those acts, through the slow building of something better than what had existed before. Walt's health began to decline in the 4th year after the incident. He was 77, and the years of hard living and old injuries were catching up with him. He spent less time at Fisher's place and more time in his apartment, though members of the community visited regularly, making sure he wasn't alone, that he had what he needed. Sarah visited him several times a week, bringing meals and company. They'd become genuinely close over the years, their relationship transcending the categories of bartender and customer, protector and protected. He was family in the truest sense, not by blood, but by choice and shared experience. One evening in late autumn, Walt asked Sarah to sit down because he had something important to say. His apartment was small but tidy, filled with photographs from his life, his time in Vietnam, his years working construction, pictures of the community he'd built through Fisher's place. "Sarah, I need you to know something," he said, his voice weaker than it used to be, but still clear. "These past 4 years have been the best of my life. After Vietnam, after everything I went through, I kind of gave up on feeling like I mattered. I went through the motions, existed, but didn't really live. And then you defended me that night in O'Malley's, and everything changed." "Walt," Sarah started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. You gave me my dignity back. You showed me I still had value. You built a community around that moment, created a place where veterans like me could feel seen and valued. You took a life that was winding down toward a lonely end and filled it with purpose and connection and joy." His eyes were wet with tears. "I'm not afraid of dying anymore, Sarah. Because I know my life mattered. I know I was loved and valued. And that's a gift you gave me." Sarah was crying too, holding Walt's weathered hand in both of hers. "Your life has always mattered, Walt. Always. I just helped remind you of that." "You did more than remind me," Walt said. "You proved it, through your actions, through the community you brought together, through the center that bears my name. You proved that my life, my service, my existence, all of it counted for something." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people whose lives had intersected at exactly the right moment, whose connection had sparked something larger than either of them could have predicted. Walt passed away peacefully in his sleep, 3 weeks later, surrounded by photographs of the people who'd loved him, in an apartment that had become a gathering place for the community rather than a cell of isolation. His funeral was held at Fisher's place, and over 300 people attended, veterans and civilians, bikers and bartenders, people whose lives he'd touched directly, and people who knew him only through the stories told at the center that bore his name. Tom Bradley gave the eulogy, his voice strong despite the grief. "Walter Fisher was a hero long before Sarah Mitchell defended him in a bar. He was a hero in Vietnam when he saved my life and the lives of others. He was a hero when he pulled a man from a burning building. He was a hero in the quiet way he lived his life, with integrity and kindness and humility. But in his final years, he became something else too. He became a symbol of why we serve, why we fight, why we build communities. He became proof that every life matters, that service is never forgotten, that courage can spark change that outlasts any individual." Tom paused, looking out at the gathered mourners. "Walt told me a few days before he passed that these last years had been his happiest, that he'd finally felt truly valued and seen. That's what Sarah gave him. And through him, what she gave all of us. The gift of recognition, of community, of mattering. Sarah stood to speak, though she'd written nothing down, trusting that the right words would come. I met Walt Fisher because I poured him beers, she began, and I defended him because I saw him being hurt and couldn't stand by. But I loved him because of who he was. Kind, gentle, humble, and brave in ways most people never recognized. He taught me what real courage looks like, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet persistence of living with integrity, of treating people with respect, of carrying scars both visible and invisible without letting them define you. She looked at Emma, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her face. He was a grandfather to my daughter when she had none. He was a friend when I needed friendship. He was living proof that service matters, that sacrifice should be honored, that we owe our veterans more than lip service and flag waving. We owe them dignity and respect and support. Sarah's voice cracked, but she pushed through. Walt, if you can hear me wherever you are, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your friendship. And thank you for letting me be part of your life. You mattered. You'll always matter. And Fisher's Place will stand as long as I have breath in my body, ensuring that your legacy of service and humility and quiet courage lives on. The funeral ended with a 21-gun salute, performed by an honor guard from the Marines, the sharp cracks of the rifles echoing through the neighborhood. The American flag that had draped Walt's casket was folded with military precision and presented to his nephew, who accepted it with tears streaming down his face. After everyone had left, Sarah stood alone in Fisher's Place, looking at the photograph of Walt that now hung on the wall of remembrance alongside pictures of other veterans who'd passed. She'd defended him 4 years ago because it was right. She'd built this place in his honor because it was necessary. And now he was gone, but the ripples of that one October evening continued to spread outward, touching lives in ways she was still discovering. Life continued, because life always does. Emma started high school with excellent grades and clear ambitions. She'd been accepted into a special program that partnered high school students with veterinary clinics, giving her hands-on experience that would strengthen her college applications. The veterinarians from the Veterans Motorcycle Club, who'd promised to mentor her, had kept their word, providing guidance and opportunities that Sarah never could have afforded on her own. Fisher's Place expanded, taking over an adjacent storefront and adding more services: a legal clinic for benefits claims, a job training program, a food pantry for veterans experiencing hardship. Sarah hired additional staff, including 2 veteran social workers and an administrative coordinator. What had started as her managing a space had grown into her running a genuine organization with a budget, a board of directors, and measurable impact on the community. The Veterans Motorcycle Club remained central to the center's work, providing volunteers and fundraising and the kind of grassroots support that no amount of grant money could replace. Tom Bradley stepped down as president after serving for 20 years, passing the role to a younger veteran. But he remained active, remaining Sarah's closest advisor and friend, the person who'd recognized what her moment of courage represented before she'd understood it herself. On the 5th anniversary of the incident at O'Malley's, Fisher's Place hosted a celebration that doubled as a fundraiser. The neighborhood street was closed off, filled with food trucks and live music, and booths from veteran service organizations. Hundreds of people attended: veterans and families, community members and city officials, even a few representatives from national veteran organizations who'd heard about the work being done in this small corner of Portland. Sarah stood on a makeshift stage, looking out at the crowd, and marveled at what had grown from that single moment. 5 years ago, she'd been a struggling bartender, one bad month away from eviction. Now she was running an organization that served thousands of veterans annually, speaking at conferences, testifying before legislative committees, making a genuine difference in people's lives. 5 years ago, she said into the microphone, I got angry in a bar. I saw someone being hurt, and I couldn't stand by. That anger, that protective instinct, changed my life in ways I never could have predicted. But more importantly, it sparked something larger. It reminded a community that veterans matter, that service should be honored, that we all have a responsibility to stand up for people who need defending. She paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Walter Fisher, who this center is named for, used to say that he was just an ordinary man who'd done what he had to do. That's how he described his service in Vietnam, his acts of heroism, his entire life. Just ordinary. Just necessary. But there's nothing ordinary about living with integrity, about serving others, about maintaining your humanity in the face of hardship. Sarah looked out at Emma, now 16, and volunteering at the merchandise booth, mature beyond her years, and grounded in values of service and community. We're all ordinary people, every one of us. But we're capable of extraordinary things when we choose courage over comfort, action over apathy, community over isolation. Fisher's Place exists because one ordinary bartender made that choice, but it thrives because hundreds of ordinary people continue making that choice every day. The crowd erupted in applause, and Sarah stepped down from the stage feeling the weight and the joy of everything that had been built. This was her life's work now, she realized. Not something she'd planned or sought, but something that had found her in a moment of fury and transformed everything that came after. Years passed, as they do. Emma graduated high school with honors and a full scholarship to Oregon State University's veterinary program, a scholarship funded in part by the Veterans Motorcycle Club's Education Foundation. She moved to Corvallis, but came home frequently, staying connected to the community that had raised her, bringing friends to volunteer at Fisher's Place, carrying forward the lessons about service and integrity that had been woven into her upbringing. Sarah watched her daughter leave for college with pride and bittersweetness, the natural emotion of any parent watching their child step into independence. But unlike the fear she'd felt years ago about whether she could provide for Emma's future, now she felt only confidence. Emma was prepared, supported, connected to a community that would help her navigate challenges. Sarah had given her that. Not alone, but with the help of the family they'd built through one moment of courage. Fisher's Place continued to grow, adding satellite locations in other Portland neighborhoods, partnering with similar organizations in other cities, becoming a model for how community-based veteran support could work. Sarah found herself traveling more, consulting with groups who wanted to replicate what had been built, sharing not just the practical aspects of running a center, but the philosophy that underpinned it. Veterans are family, service matters, courage comes in many forms, and community is built through individual acts of standing up for what's right. Tom Bradley, now in his 70s, slowed down but never stopped. He remained a fixture at Fisher's Place, mentoring younger veterans, sharing stories, providing the kind of grandfatherly wisdom that only came from decades of lived experience. He and Sarah had become so close that people often mistook them for actual family, a mistake neither bothered to correct because it felt true in all the ways that mattered. One evening, almost 8 years after the incident at O'Malley's, Tom and Sarah sat in the quiet room at Fisher's Place after everyone else had gone home. They were sharing a pizza and reflecting on how far things had come. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't defended Walt that night?" Tom asked. Sarah considered the question. "Sometimes. I'd probably still be bartending at O'Malley's, still struggling to make ends meet, still worried about Emma's future. I'd probably be okay. I've always been a survivor. But I wouldn't have this. She gestured around at the center. I wouldn't have purpose beyond survival. I wouldn't have you and all the others as family. And we wouldn't have Fisher's Place, Tom added. Hundreds of veterans wouldn't have the support they've received here. The ripples would be completely different. Do you ever wonder how many moments like that happen every day? Sarah mused. How many opportunities for courage that people either take or don't take, and how those choices change everything that comes after. All the time, Tom said. Every day people have choices about whether to act or turn away. Most turn away. Not because they're bad people, but because acting is hard and scary and uncertain. You didn't turn away. That's what made all the difference. I got lucky, Sarah said. It could have gone differently. I could have been fired, sued, hurt. The universe rewarded my anger. But it doesn't always work that way. No, Tom agreed. It doesn't. But you know what? I think you would have defended Walt even if you'd known there would be no reward, no bikers showing up, no community center in your future. You would have done it because it was right. Sarah nodded slowly. Yeah, I would have. Because some things matter more than self-preservation. Some things you can't stand by and watch without losing something fundamental about who you are. That's the real lesson of your story, Tom said. Not that courage gets rewarded, though sometimes it does. But that courage is its own reward. That maintaining your integrity, standing up for your values, defending people who need defending, that's what lets you sleep at night. That's what lets you look at yourself in the mirror and like the person looking back. They sat in comfortable silence, two people whose lives had been fundamentally altered by a moment of protective fury in a bar 8 years ago. Around them, Fisher's Place stood as testament to what could grow from such moments, not just a building or an organization, but a philosophy, a community, a living example of what happened when people chose courage. On the 10th anniversary of the incident, Fisher's Place hosted its largest celebration yet. The original location had expanded multiple times, and there were now 3 satellite centers serving different Portland neighborhoods. The organization employed 15 people and relied on over 100 regular volunteers. Thousands of veterans had been served, with measurable impacts on employment, housing stability, mental health, and community connection. Emma, now 22 and in her final year of veterinary school, came home for the celebration. She'd grown into an impressive young woman, confident, compassionate, driven by the same values of service that had defined her upbringing. She was already planning to return to Portland after graduation, to open a practice that would provide low-cost veterinary care to veterans and their service animals. Another ripple, Sarah realized. Another way that one moment of courage continued to echo forward. The celebration drew city officials, state representatives, and even a U.S. senator who'd taken an interest in community-based veteran support models. But more importantly, it drew veterans, hundreds of them, from every era of service, every branch of military, every background imaginable. They came to celebrate not just Fisher's Place, but the philosophy it represented, that veterans matter, that service should be honored, that community is built through individual acts of courage. Sarah was asked to give a speech, and she stood before the assembled crowd feeling the weight of a decade's worth of growth and change. She was 42 now, with streaks of gray in her brown hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent working hard and caring deeply. She looked different than the desperate bartender who'd vaulted over a bar to defend an old man. She felt different too, grounded, purposeful, connected to something larger than herself. 10 years ago, she began, I made a choice. It wasn't a carefully considered decision. It wasn't strategic or planned. It was pure instinct, seeing someone hurt and refusing to accept it. That choice changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. But here's what I've learned in the decade since. We all make those choices every single day. She looked out at the crowd, making eye contact with faces she'd come to know well over the years. Every day, we choose whether to act or turn away, whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to defend someone who needs defending or decide it's not our problem. Those choices matter. They shape who we are, what our communities become, what kind of world we're building for the next generation. Sarah gestured to Emma, standing near the front with Tom Bradley. My daughter is going to be a veterinarian because a community of veterans invested in her future. That investment happened because I defended one of them when he needed it. But it could have gone differently. If I'd stayed behind that bar, if I'd decided it wasn't my problem, if I'd chosen self-preservation over action, everything would be different. Not just for me and Emma, but for the thousands of veterans who've been served by this place. She paused, letting that sink in. I'm not saying everyone needs to start a nonprofit or become an advocate. I'm saying that every act of courage matters. Every time you stand up for someone, every time you refuse to accept injustice, every time you choose action over apathy, you're planting seeds whose harvest you may never fully see. You're creating ripples that will spread farther than you can imagine. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Walter Fisher, who this place is named for, was an ordinary man who lived an extraordinary life. He served in Vietnam, saved lives, came home and lived with integrity and humility. When I defended him, I wasn't defending a symbol or making a political statement. I was defending a human being who deserved dignity. That's all it was. That's all it ever needed to be. She looked around at Fisher's place, the building, the people, the community that had grown from that single moment. This is what's possible when we choose courage, when we refuse to turn away from injustice, when we build communities that honor service and support those who need support. It's not easy. It requires sacrifice and hard work and the willingness to be uncomfortable. But it's worth it. God, it's so worth it. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, tears of gratitude and pride and overwhelming emotion at everything that had been built, everything that had grown from one moment of protective fury. After the speeches ended and the celebration continued, Sarah found herself surrounded by people wanting to thank her, to share their stories, to tell her how Fisher's Place had changed their lives. She listened to each one, understanding now what Tom had tried to tell her years ago. This was never just about her. This was about what her actions represented, about the message they sent to veterans that they mattered, about the example they provided to others, about the importance of courage. Late in the evening, as the crowd began to thin, a young man approached her. He was maybe 19, wearing civilian clothes, but with the bearing of someone military. He looked nervous, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Ms. Mitchell? I'm Private Daniel Cooper. I ship out to basic training next week. That's wonderful, Daniel. What branch? Army. Infantry. He paused, gathering courage. I wanted to come here tonight because, well, my dad is a veteran. He served in Afghanistan, came back pretty messed up. PTSD, substance abuse, the whole thing. He was homeless for a while, living on the streets, and I thought we'd lost him forever. Sarah listened, her heart aching with familiar sympathy. She'd heard so many stories like this over the years. But then he found Fisher's Place, Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. The people here, they helped him, got him into treatment, helped him find housing, gave him a community. He's been sober for 3 years now. He's working again. He's my dad again. Tears were running down the young man's face. And because of that, because he got better, I decided I wanted to serve too. I wanted to be part of something that matters, something bigger than myself. Sarah felt her own tears returning. Your father did the hard work, Daniel. He's the one. He's the who chose recovery, who did the work to get better. But this place gave him the support to make that possible, Daniel insisted. And it all started because you defended some old veteran in a bar. That's what my dad told me. He said courage is contagious, that your act of standing up for someone inspired other acts of standing up, and eventually those ripples reached him when he needed them most. He pulled something from his pocket, a challenge coin, the kind military units give out to signify membership and achievement. My dad wanted me to give this to you. It's from his unit in Afghanistan. He said you've earned it, that you're as much a part of his recovery as any veteran who served beside him. Sarah accepted the coin with shaking hands, feeling the weight of it. Not just the physical weight, but the symbolic weight of this young man's father's service, his struggle, his recovery, and now his son's choice to serve as well. All of it connected, somehow, to that October evening a decade ago when she'd seen injustice and refused to accept it. Tell your father thank you, Sarah managed. Tell him I'm proud of him and proud of you for choosing to serve. And tell him to come by Fisher's Place anytime he needs community or support. That's what we're here for. Daniel nodded, wiped his eyes, and walked away. Sarah stood holding the challenge coin, turning it over in her fingers, marveling once again at the impossible complexity of how lives intersect and influence each other. Tom appeared at her elbow, having witnessed the exchange. You okay? Yeah, Sarah said, though she was crying. Just understanding again how much that one moment mattered, how many lives it touched, how far the ripples spread. Courage is contagious, Tom quoted. That kid's dad was right about that. When people see someone standing up for what's right, it gives them permission to do the same. It reminds them that they're not alone, that their struggles matter, that there are people who will fight for them. Sarah looked out at the celebration still happening around them. Veterans and families, volunteers and staff, community members who'd been drawn into the orbit of Fisher's Place and the values it represented. We did something good here, Tom. You did something good, Tom corrected gently. The rest of us just followed your lead. No, Sarah said firmly. This was never just me. This was a community choosing to come together, choosing to support each other, choosing to honor the courage and sacrifice of veterans. I started it, maybe, but all of you built it. They stood together watching the celebration. Two people who'd become family through shared purpose and values, who'd built something that would outlast them both. The years continued their relentless march forward. Emma graduated from veterinary school and opened her practice, Paws for Patriots, offering reduced-cost care for veterans' animals and free services for service dogs. The practice thrived, becoming another node in the network of support that had grown around Fisher's Place. Sarah continued running the center, though she gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations, trusting her staff and empowering younger veterans to take leadership roles. She remained the organization's face and its philosophical heart, but she understood that for Fisher's Place to truly succeed, it had to transcend any individual, even her. Tom Bradley passed away peacefully at 79, surrounded by family, both biological and chosen. His funeral was massive, attended by hundreds of veterans and community members whose lives he'd touched. Sarah gave the eulogy, her voice steady despite her grief, honoring the man who'd recognized what her courage meant before she'd understood it herself. Tom Bradley taught me that courage comes in many forms, she said. The courage to serve in combat. The courage to come home and rebuild a shattered life. The courage to build community when isolation would be easier. The courage to recognize someone else's moment of bravery and amplify it into something larger. She looked out at the assembled mourners. Tom took my anger, my protective instinct in a bar one night, and helped transform it into Fisher's Place, into a philosophy of service and support. He saw potential I didn't know I had. He believed in the power of community before I understood what community could mean. And he spent his final years making sure that veterans knew they mattered, that their service was honored, that they had support when they needed it. Sarah's voice cracked. I'm going to miss him every day, but his legacy lives on in every veteran who walks through the doors of Fisher's Place, in every act of courage that people choose because they've seen that courage matters, in every community that comes together to support those who've served. Tom taught us how to honor veterans not with empty words, but with genuine support and unwavering commitment. That's how we keep his memory alive, by continuing that work, by maintaining that commitment, by choosing courage every single day. After the funeral, Sarah stood at Tom's grave with Emma beside her, both of them crying for the loss of a man who'd been grandfather, mentor, friend, and the architect of everything good that had come from that October evening so long ago. Mom, Emma said quietly, you know what Tom told me the last time I saw him? What, honey? He said that defending Mr. Fisher was the most important thing you'd ever done, but that the second most important thing was teaching me to do the same. He said courage is learned, that it's passed down from generation to generation, and that I had a responsibility to carry forward what you'd taught me. Sarah pulled her daughter close, understanding that this was indeed the ultimate ripple, her daughter inheriting not just the story of that October evening, but the values it represented. Emma would teach those values to her own children someday, and they would teach theirs, and the ripples would continue spreading long after Sarah herself was gone. 15 years after the incident at O'Malley's, Sarah was invited to testify before a congressional committee examining community-based approaches to veteran support. She was 47 now, her hair more gray than brown, her face showing the marks of years spent working hard for something she believed in. But her eyes were bright, her voice strong, her purpose clear. She told the committee the story they'd all read in briefing materials, the bartender who'd defended a veteran, the community that had rallied around her, the organization that had grown from that moment. But she also told them things that weren't in any report. What it felt like to see someone hurt and know you couldn't turn away, what it meant to build family from courage and shared values, what happened when communities committed to genuinely supporting veterans rather than just thanking them for their service. Fisher's Place exists because one night I got angry, she told the assembled lawmakers, but it thrives because hundreds of people made the same choice I made, to refuse to accept that veterans should struggle alone, to commit to supporting them with actions instead of just words, to build something larger than any individual. She leaned forward, her intensity filling the room. You can't legislate courage. You can't mandate community. But you can create conditions where both can flourish. You can fund programs that work. You can remove barriers that prevent veterans from accessing support. You can honor service not with parades and platitudes, but with genuine commitment to ensuring veterans have what they need to thrive. Sarah pulled out the challenge coin that Daniel Cooper's father had given her years ago, holding it up for the committee to see. This coin represents a man who served in Afghanistan, came home broken, found support at Fisher's Place, recovered, and inspired his son to serve. That's a ripple that started with me defending an old man in a bar and spread outward to touch lives I'll never meet, to create impacts I'll never fully understand. That's what's possible when communities commit to supporting veterans. Not just one success story, but thousands. Not just one moment of courage, but a culture of courage that perpetuates itself. She set the coin down on the table in front of her. I'm not a policy expert. I'm a former bartender who runs a community center, but I know what works because I've seen it work for 15 years. Community-based support, led by veterans themselves, funded adequately, and given the flexibility to respond to local needs. That works. Peer support and mentorship that works. Treating veterans as individuals with unique needs, rather than as a monolithic group. That works. Creating spaces where veterans feel valued and understood. That works. Sarah's testimony lasted 2 hours, and by the end, several committee members had tears in their eyes. The resulting legislation, the Community-Based Veteran Support Act, included funding for programs modeled on Fisher's Place in communities across the country. It wasn't everything Sarah had asked for, but it was something. Another ripple, spreading outward. 20 years after that October evening in O'Malley's, Sarah stood in the original Fisher's Place during a quiet moment. The center was preparing for its 20th anniversary celebration, but right now, in the early morning before anyone else arrived, Sarah was alone with her memories. She walked through the space, touching photographs on the walls. Walt Fisher, forever 73 and smiling. Tom Bradley, in his leather vest covered in patches. Veterans who'd been helped by the center, whose lives had been changed by the community built here. Some of them were gone now, claimed by age or illness or the demons they'd been fighting. But they'd all mattered. They'd all been part of something larger. Sarah stopped in front of the wall where her civilian service medal hung, alongside the broken phone from that night. Someone had retrieved it and framed it as a reminder of where everything started. Next to it was the challenge coin from Daniel Cooper's father, and dozens of other coins and patches and medals that veterans had given her over the years. Tokens of appreciation, symbols of belonging, physical representations of the family she'd built through one moment of courage. The door opened, and Emma entered. Now 32, a successful veterinarian with her own practice, married to another veterinarian, pregnant with Sarah's first grandchild. She'd taken the day off to help with the anniversary preparations, continuing the tradition of service that had defined her upbringing. "Hey, Mom. You okay?" "Yeah, honey. Just thinking about how much has changed." Emma came to stand beside her, looking at the wall of memories. "Do you ever regret it? The path your life took because you defended Mr. Fisher?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Her life had been completely transformed by that moment. No longer bartending, no longer struggling financially, no longer isolated and desperate. But it had also been harder in some ways, carrying the responsibility of Fisher's Place, being a symbol when she'd never wanted to be one, living with the weight of expectations and the knowledge that her choices affected so many lives. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. Even the hard parts. Even the moments when I felt overwhelmed or inadequate or uncertain. Because look at what came from it." She gestured around at the center. "Look at what we built. Look at the lives that have been changed. Look at who you've become." Emma smiled, placing a hand on her rounded belly. "This baby is going to grow up hearing the story of their grandmother defending a veteran in a bar. They're going to learn about courage and integrity and standing up for what's right. They're going to be raised in a community that values service and supports those who need support. That's your legacy, Mom. Not just Fisher's Place, but the values that live on through all of us. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Happy tears, proud tears, tears of gratitude for a life that had been transformed by anger, channeled into action. "That's a good legacy," she said softly. "Better than I ever imagined I'd leave." They stood together in the quiet center, mother and daughter, surrounded by the physical evidence of what could grow from a single moment of courage. Outside, Portland was waking up, the city going about its business. But in this space, in Fisher's Place, the legacy of Walter Fisher and Sarah Mitchell's defense of him lived on, continuing to change lives, continuing to spread ripples outward into an unknowable future. The 20th anniversary celebration was massive, the largest gathering Fisher's Place had ever hosted. The neighborhood street was closed for blocks, filled with booths and stages and thousands of people who'd come to celebrate what had been built. There were veterans from every era, families who'd been helped by the center, politicians and community leaders, representatives from the dozens of similar organizations that had been inspired by Fisher's Place's model. Sarah was asked to speak, and she stood on the main stage looking out at the ocean of faces. So many lives touched, so many connections made, so many ripples spreading outward from that one October evening 20 years ago. 20 years ago, she began, I was a different person, living a different life. I was a bartender struggling to make ends meet, worried about my daughter's future, surviving but not really thriving. And then one night I saw an old veteran named Walter Fisher get tripped and humiliated by 3 young men who thought his life didn't matter, and I got angry. She paused, letting the silence build. That anger changed everything. Not because anger itself is transformative, but because I channeled it into action. I refused to accept injustice. I stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself. And in doing so, I discovered something fundamental about what it means to be human. We need each other. We need community. We need to know that when we fall, someone will help us up. That when we struggle, someone will stand beside us. That when we're hurt, someone will defend us. Sarah looked out at the crowd, seeing faces she'd come to know well over 2 decades, seeing strangers who'd been drawn to this story of courage and community. Fisher's Place exists because Walter Fisher mattered, because every veteran matters, because service demands honor, sacrifice requires recognition, and courage, true courage, means refusing to turn away when you see someone suffering. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. But this place is more than a building or an organization. It's a living example of what's possible when people choose courage over comfort, community over isolation, action over apathy. Every person who walks through these doors, every veteran who finds support here, every family that's been helped, they're all part of a story that started with one moment of protective fury and grew into something that transcends any individual. Sarah paused, her eyes finding Emma in the crowd, hand resting on her pregnant belly. My daughter is about to make me a grandmother. That child will grow up in a world shaped by the choices we make today. They'll inherit not just our successes and failures, but our values and our commitments. And I want them to inherit a world where courage matters, where standing up for others is normal rather than exceptional, where communities take care of their own. She looked around at the assembled crowd. Thousands of people gathered to celebrate what had been built from one moment of anger and action. 20 years ago, I thought I was just defending an old man in a bar. But I was doing something much larger. I was affirming that his life had value, that his service mattered, that he deserved dignity and respect, and that affirmation rippled outward in ways I never could have predicted. Sarah's voice broke slightly with emotion. Walter Fisher passed away 16 years ago, but his legacy lives on. Tom Bradley, who brought the Veterans Motorcycle Club to my doorstep and changed my life forever, passed away 5 years ago, but his legacy lives on. Every veteran who's been helped by Fisher's Place, every family that's found support here, every act of courage that someone chose because they saw that courage could make a difference, all of it is part of a story that's bigger than any of us. She held up her hands, encompassing the entire scene. This is what happens when one person refuses to turn away, when communities rally around shared values, when we commit to supporting those who've sacrificed for us. This is the harvest of seeds planted 20 years ago in a moment of protective fury. And the harvest continues, spreading outward, touching lives we'll never know, creating ripples that will extend far beyond our lifetimes. Sarah's voice rose with conviction. So I challenge everyone here, everyone listening to this story, to find your own moment, to see injustice and refuse to accept it, to stand up for someone who needs defending, to choose courage even when it's scary, even when it might cost you, even when you don't know how it will turn out. Because that's how we change the world. Not through grand gestures or perfect plans, but through individual acts of courage that inspire other acts of courage, that build communities, that create cultures where doing the right thing is just what we do. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and Sarah stepped down from the stage feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. She was immediately surrounded by people wanting to thank her, to share their stories, to tell her how Fisher's Place had changed their lives. She listened to each one, understanding that this was her life's work, not just building an organization, but bearing witness to the power of courage and community, being a living reminder that individual actions matter. As the celebration continued into the evening, Sarah found a quiet corner and sat down, her feet aching and her heart full. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see a man in his 50s wearing a leather vest covered in military patches. He looked vaguely familiar, but she couldn't quite place him. "Ms. Mitchell, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Daniel Cooper." Sarah's eyes widened. Daniel? Private Cooper who shipped out to basic training? She stood up, taking in the man before her, no longer the nervous 19-year-old who'd given her his father's challenge coin, but a mature veteran with his own service behind him. "That's me, Sergeant Cooper now, retired after 20 years in the Army." He smiled. "I wanted to come today because, well, I owe you more than I ever told you that night 15 years ago." "Your father, how is he?" Daniel's smile faltered slightly. "He passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. But he died sober, surrounded by family, at peace with himself. The last 15 years of his life were good ones, full of purpose and connection. And that was because of this place, because of what you built." "I'm so sorry for your loss," Sarah said. "But I'm glad he had those years." "Me too. And I wanted you to know, I just became the director of a new veterans center in Seattle. We're using Fisher's Place as our model. Everything you've built here, everything you've learned, we're replicating it. And there are centers in Spokane and Eugene and Boise doing the same thing. Your courage 20 years ago, it's still spreading, still creating ripples." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to say." "Say you're proud," Daniel suggested. "Say you understand that what you started has grown beyond anything you imagined. Say you know that your moment of anger in a bar has been transformed into a national movement of community-based veteran support." "I'm proud," Sarah whispered, "and overwhelmed, and grateful." Daniel pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn, faded challenge coin, the same one his father had given Sarah 20 years ago. I've carried a duplicate of this through 3 deployments. It reminded me why I was serving, what I was fighting for. I wanted to show you, to prove that the ripples are still spreading, that the courage is still contagious, that what you started continues to matter. They stood together for a moment, veteran and the woman who'd defended his father's friend, connected by threads of courage and service, and the profound impact of choosing to act when action was needed. Later that night, after the celebration had ended, and the streets had been cleaned and the last visitors had gone home, Sarah sat in her living room with Emma. They'd kicked off their shoes and were drinking tea, processing everything that had happened that day. 20 years, Emma said quietly. It's hard to believe it's been that long. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, Sarah replied. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Do you remember what you were thinking when you jumped over that bar? Sarah considered the question carefully. I remember seeing Walt on the ground and those men laughing. I remember fury, pure, white-hot fury that they would hurt someone and find it funny. I remember thinking, not on my watch, not while I'm here, not to him. Everything else was just instinct, reaction. I didn't think about consequences or plan what I'd do next. I just acted. That's real courage, Emma said. Not the absence of fear, but the inability to do anything other than what's right. Tom Bradley told me that, Sarah said with a sad smile. About a week after the bikers showed up. I didn't really understand it then. I thought courage was supposed to be noble and heroic, not just getting angry and breaking someone's phone. But it was noble and heroic, Emma insisted. You stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself. You put yourself at risk. Your job, your safety, everything, because you couldn't watch someone suffer. That's the definition of heroic. Sarah looked at her daughter, seeing the woman she'd become, understanding that Emma had internalized the lessons of that October evening in ways that would shape her own choices for the rest of her life. You're going to be a good mother, she said suddenly. You're going to teach your child what I tried to teach you. That courage matters, that standing up for others is not optional, that we all have a responsibility to make the world better. I learned from the best, Emma said, reaching over to squeeze her mother's hand. They sat, in comfortable silence, mother and daughter, surrounded by the quiet of a house that no longer echoed with desperation and fear. Sarah thought about the apartment she'd lived in 20 years ago. Small, shabby, always one emergency away from disaster. She thought about the woman she'd been then. Exhausted, worried, surviving, but not thriving. And she thought about the woman she was now. Still tired sometimes, still worried about things, but grounded in purpose and community, and the knowledge that her life mattered. Mom? Emma's voice broke into her thoughts. What do you think Mr. Fisher would say if he could see all this? If he could see what grew from you defending him? Sarah smiled through tears. I think he'd say the same thing he always said. I'm just an ordinary man who did what I had to do. He'd deflect and redirect, try to make it about everyone else rather than himself. But I hope he'd be proud. I hope he'd understand that his life mattered enormously, that defending him was one of the most important things I've ever done, and that his legacy lives on in every person who's been helped by Fisher's place. He'd be proud, Emma said with certainty. He'd be so proud of you, and of everything that's been built, and of how his name has become synonymous with honor and service and community support. I hope so, Sarah whispered. I really hope so. The months after the 20th anniversary brought a new rhythm to Sarah's life. She officially stepped down as executive director of Fisher's Place transitioning into a consulting and advisory role that allowed her to support the organization without carrying the day-to-day operational burden. A younger veteran, a woman who'd served in Iraq and understood intimately the challenges veterans faced, took over as director, bringing fresh energy and new ideas while maintaining the core philosophy that had always guided the center. Sarah found herself with time she hadn't had in years. Time to think, to reflect, to process 2 decades of incredible transformation. She started writing, not a memoir exactly, but reflections on courage and community and what she'd learned from 20 years of serving veterans. The writing was therapeutic, helping her understand her own journey and articulate the lessons that might help others. Emma gave birth to a healthy baby girl in the spring, and Sarah held her granddaughter for the first time with tears streaming down her face. They named her Grace Fisher Mitchell. Grace for the grace they'd been shown, Fisher to honor Walter Fisher's memory, Mitchell to carry forward the family name. "She's going to hear the story," Emma said, as Sarah cradled the baby, about how her grandmother defended a veteran and changed the world, about how courage is contagious and communities are built through individual acts of standing up for what's right. "Make sure she understands it wasn't about me being special," Sarah said. "It was about making a choice that anyone could make, that everyone should make." "I'll make sure," Emma promised. "But I'll also make sure she understands that you were brave, that you put yourself at risk for someone else, and that your courage literally changed the course of our family's history." Sarah looked down at Grace, this tiny human who would grow up in a world shaped by choices made before she was born, who would inherit values and stories and a legacy of service and courage. She thought about the generational impact of that October evening 20 years ago, how it had changed not just her life, but Emma's, and now Grace's, and eventually Grace's children and grandchildren. Ripples spreading forward through time, touching lives that wouldn't exist for decades yet. 25 years after the incident at O'Malley's, Fisher's Place had become a national model. There were over 50 centers across the country using its approach, collectively serving tens of thousands of veterans annually. The Community-Based Veteran Support Act had been reauthorized twice, with expanded funding and additional provisions. Based on lessons learned from the network of Fisher's Place-inspired centers. Sarah was 52, officially retired from organizational management, but still deeply involved in the veteran support community. She gave talks and wrote articles and consulted with new centers starting up. She'd published a book, Courage and Community, Lessons from Fisher's Place, that had become required reading for people working in veteran services. But more than any professional accomplishments, Sarah treasured her time with Grace. The little girl was now 5 years old, curious and kind, and already showing signs of the empathy and courage that defined her family. Sarah would watch her play with other children, see her standing up for kids who were being left out or treated unclean, and recognize the seeds of values that had been planted 25 years ago in a moment of protective fury. One afternoon, Sarah took Grace to the original Fisher's Place. The building had been expanded multiple times, but the core of it, the space where Walt had sat at his usual table, where Tom had held court, where Sarah had spent countless hours building community, remained largely unchanged. "Grandma," Grace asked, looking at the photographs on the wall. "Which one is Mr. Fisher? The man you saved?" Sarah pointed to Walt's picture, his weathered face smiling, his eyes kind, his bearing humble. "That's him. Walter Fisher. He was a very brave man who served our country in Vietnam." "And the bad men hurt him?" They tripped him and laughed at him because they thought he didn't matter. But he did matter. He mattered very much. Grace studied the photograph seriously. So you got mad and helped him? Yes. I got very mad, and I made the bad men leave, and I helped Mr. Fisher. And then all his biker friends came and said thank you? Sarah smiled at the simplified version of events that Emma had told Grace. That's right. His friends came to say thank you, and they became my friends too. And we built this place to help other veterans. Grace was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she looked up at Sarah with solemn eyes. If I see someone being hurt, I should help them too. Right, Grandma? Right, sweetie. You should always stand up for people who need help. Even if I'm scared? Especially if you're scared, Sarah said, kneeling down to Grace's level. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you're scared. Grace nodded, understanding in the way children sometimes do, seeing truth clearly without the complications adults add. Okay, Grandma, I'll be brave like you. Sarah pulled her granddaughter into a hug, feeling the weight and the joy of passing values forward to another generation. This was the ultimate ripple, she realized. Not the centers or the legislation or the national recognition, but this. Teaching a 5-year-old that courage matters, that standing up for others is what we do, that individual actions can change the world. 30 years after the incident at O'Malley's, Sarah attended the opening of the 100th Fisher's Place-inspired center, this one in rural Montana, serving veterans in a community that had previously had few support resources. She was 57 now, her hair completely gray, her body showing the wear of decades of hard work. But her spirit remained strong, her commitment to veteran support unwavering. The opening ceremony was attended by veterans from across the state, by the governor, by representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and by directors from the other 99 centers in the network. Sarah was asked to cut the ribbon, and she stood with scissors in hand, thinking about how far things had come from one angry bartender defending an old man in a Portland bar. 30 years ago, she said to the assembled crowd, I made a choice. I saw injustice and refused to accept it. That choice led to this, to 100 centers serving hundreds of thousands of veterans across this country. But the real story isn't about me or even about Fisher's Place. It's about what happens when communities decide that veterans matter, that service deserves honor, that we all have a responsibility to stand up for people who need defending. She looked out at the faces watching her, veterans and civilians, young and old, diverse in every way but united in their commitment to serving those who'd served. Every person here has made that same choice I made 30 years ago. Maybe not in the same dramatic way, maybe not in a moment captured on security footage and shared across the country, but in small ways, in daily choices, in consistent commitment to making things better. That's the real courage. That's the real heroism. Not one grand gesture, but thousands of small choices, day after day, year after year, to stand up for what's right. Sarah cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted in applause. The 100th Center was officially open, ready to serve veterans who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of support. Later, at the reception, a young woman approached Sarah. She was maybe 25, wearing a volunteer t-shirt and carrying a toddler on her hip. Ms. Mitchell, I'm Jessica Torres. We met years ago at Fisher's Place in Portland. You probably don't remember me. But Sarah did remember. Corporal Torres, you were deploying to Germany. You told me about your grandfather, how Fisher's Place had helped him recover. Jessica's eyes widened. You remember? Of course I remember. How is your grandfather? He passed away 5 years ago, but peacefully, surrounded by family. Those last years of his life, after he found Fisher's place, they were good years, happy years. Jessica shifted the toddler to her other hip. I wanted you to meet someone. This is Walter, named after Walter Fisher, the veteran you defended. My grandfather insisted. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at this child named after Walt, this living embodiment of how ripples spread forward through generations. Hello, Walter, she said softly. You're named after a very brave man. I tell him the story, Jessica said, about how my grandfather struggled, how he found help at Fisher's place, how that help started because you defended Mr. Fisher 30 years ago. When he's older, he'll understand that he's part of something larger, a legacy of service and courage and standing up for what's right. Your grandfather did the hard work, Sarah said, the same words she'd said so many times over the years. But Jessica shook her head. He always said he couldn't have done it without support, without a community that made him feel valued, without knowing that people cared whether he lived or died. Jessica's voice was thick with emotion. You gave him that. You gave him a reason to fight through the darkness. And because of that, I got my grandfather back. My son will grow up hearing stories about a great-grandfather who served his country and found his way home. That's your legacy, Ms. Mitchell. Not just buildings or organizations, but families stayed intact, lives saved, futures made possible. Sarah held little Walter carefully, this child named after her old friend, this continuation of ripples she'd set in motion 3 decades ago. She thought about Walt Fisher, humble, gentle, brave in ways the world often failed to recognize. She thought about how his life had intersected with hers in a moment of crisis, how that intersection had changed everything for both of them. And she thought about how many other Walters there were, children and grandchildren named after veterans, families healed, lives transformed, all connected by invisible threads to that October evening when a bartender got angry and refused to turn away. Sarah lived to see the opening of the 200th Fisher's Place Inspired Center. She was 72 by then, slowed by age but still sharp, still engaged, still committed to the work that had defined her adult life. Grace was 42, following in Emma's footsteps as a veterinarian, raising her own children with the same values of courage and service that had been passed down through generations. On the 50th anniversary of the incident at O'Malley's, the original Fisher's Place hosted one final celebration, billed as a retrospective, a chance to look back on 5 decades of work and impact. Sarah was frail by then, using a cane not unlike the one Walt had carried, but she insisted on attending, on being present for this milestone. The celebration was massive, drawing thousands of people from across the country. There were veterans who'd been helped by Fisher's Place, families whose lives had been changed, staff and volunteers who'd dedicated careers to this work. There were the directors of all 200 centers, forming a living network of commitment to community-based veteran support. Sarah stood, supported by Emma on one side and Grace on the other, and addressed the crowd one final time. 50 years ago, she began, her voice still strong despite her age, I was a 32-year-old bartender working at O'Malley's in Portland. I was exhausted, broke, worried about my daughter's future, and just trying to survive. And then one evening, I saw an elderly veteran named Walter Fisher get tripped and humiliated by 3 young men who thought his life didn't matter. She paused, letting the familiar story settle over the crowd. Most of them had heard it before, but it never lost its power, never stopped resonating. I got angry. Not just irritated or uncomfortable, but furious. Protective. I couldn't stand by and watch someone suffer, especially not someone who'd served our country. So I vaulted over that bar, something I'd never done before and never did again, and I confronted those men. I made them leave. I broke one of their phones, and in doing so, I set in motion ripples that spread farther than I ever could have imagined. Sarah looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, veteran and civilian, connected by shared values and commitment to a cause larger than themselves. 50 years, 200 centers, millions of veterans served, countless families helped. All of it because one person refused to turn away from injustice. But here's what I've learned. It was never really about me. It was about what that moment represented. It was about affirming that veterans matter, that service deserves honor, that we all have a responsibility to stand up for people who need defending. Her voice grew softer, more reflective. Walter Fisher died 44 years ago, but his legacy lives on. Tom Bradley, who brought the Veterans Motorcycle Club to my doorstep and changed my life, died 25 years ago, but his legacy lives on. And when I die, which won't be too long now, if I'm being honest, I hope my legacy lives on too. Not in buildings or organizations, though those are important, but in the values we've passed forward, in the courage we've inspired, in the communities we've built, in the commitment to standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs us, even when we don't know how it will turn out. Sarah's eyes found Grace's children in the crowd. Great-grandchildren who'd never known Walt or Tom, but who'd grown up hearing their stories, learning their values, understanding that courage and community were not optional, but essential. Every person here carries forward the work we started 50 years ago. Every act of kindness, every moment of standing up for someone who needs defending, every choice to build community rather than turn away. All of it matters. All of it creates ripples. All of it changes the world in ways we can't predict or measure. She smiled, tears streaming down her weathered face. So, thank you. Thank you for being here, for caring about this work, for committing to supporting veterans and their families. Thank you for proving that courage is contagious, that community is possible, that individual actions ripple outward into futures we'll never see. And thank you for honoring Walter Fisher's memory, for ensuring that his life and the lives of all veterans matter not just in words, but in actions. The crowd rose in a final standing ovation, and Sarah stood supported by her daughter and granddaughter, surrounded by the living legacy of one moment of protective fury half a century ago. She'd lived long enough to see the full harvest of seeds planted that October evening. She'd witnessed ripples spreading across the country, touching millions of lives, creating a culture of support and honor for veterans that hadn't existed before. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Sarah Mitchell passed away peacefully 6 months after the 50th anniversary celebration, surrounded by family, in a room filled with photographs and medals and challenge coins, physical reminders of a life well lived, of courage honored, of ripples that would continue spreading long after she was gone. Her funeral was held at the original Fisher's Place. The building expanded one final time to accommodate the thousands who came to pay respects. Veterans from every era stood honor guard. The directors of all 200 centers attended. Emma gave the eulogy, with Grace standing beside her for support. "My mother taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear," Emma said, her voice steady despite tears. "It's the inability to do anything other than what's right, even when you're afraid. She taught me that community is built through individual acts of standing up for others. She taught me that every life matters, that service deserves honor, and that we all have a responsibility to make the world better. Emma paused, looking out at the assembled mourners. 50 years ago, my mother saw an elderly veteran being hurt, and she couldn't turn away. That moment of courage changed our family forever. It changed countless families. It created a national movement of community-based veteran support. It inspired millions of people to choose courage in their own lives. And it all started because one exhausted bartender got angry at injustice and refused to accept it. She smiled through tears. Mom would tell you that she was ordinary, that anyone would have done the same thing. But that's not true. Most people turn away. Most people decide it's not their problem. Most people choose comfort over courage. My mother chose differently. And in doing so, she showed us all what's possible when we refuse to accept injustice, when we stand up for people who need defending, when we build communities around shared values of honor and service and courage. Emma's voice grew stronger. So we honor her memory not with grief alone, but with commitment. Commitment to continuing the work she started. Commitment to standing up for veterans and their families. Commitment to choosing courage every single day. That's how we keep her legacy alive. That's how we ensure that her life, like Walter Fisher's life, like Tom Bradley's life, like the lives of all the veterans we serve, matters not just in memory, but in ongoing action. The funeral ended with a 21-gun salute, the sharp cracks of rifles echoing through the neighborhood where Sarah had lived and worked, and built something that would outlast her. The flag that had draped her casket was folded and presented to Emma, who accepted it with Grace standing beside her, both of them crying, both of them understanding that they carried forward not just Sarah's memory, but her values, her courage, her commitment to making the world better. Years passed, as they always do. Grace took over as CEO of the Fisher's Place National Network, bringing fresh energy while maintaining the core philosophy her grandmother had established. The 200 centers became 300, then 400. The work expanded to include not just veterans, but their families, recognizing that service and sacrifice rippled through entire family systems. Grace's children grew up hearing the story of their great-grandmother Sarah defending Walter Fisher in a bar decades before they were born. They learned about courage and community. They volunteered at Fisher's Place centers. They carried forward values that stretched back through generations, all the way to that October evening when one person refused to turn away from injustice. The original O'Malley's Bar was eventually designated as a historical landmark, a bronze plaque mounted outside telling the story of what had happened there. The security footage from that evening, grainy and poor quality, but unmistakably showing Sarah vaulting over the bar to defend Walt, was preserved in the Smithsonian as an example of everyday courage that sparked national change. But more important than any plaque or preservation was the living legacy. Hundreds of thousands of veterans served, families kept intact, communities built around shared values, and generations raised to believe that courage matters, that standing up for others is not optional, that we all have a responsibility to make the world better. Sarah Mitchell had been an ordinary person who made an extraordinary choice. And that choice, made in a moment of protective fury, without thought to reward or recognition, had rippled forward through time to touch millions of lives, to create institutions that would outlast any individual, to inspire countless other acts of courage in ways impossible to predict or measure. This was the true harvest of courage, not the immediate reward, not the recognition, not even the institutions built, but the values passed forward, the ripples spreading endlessly outward, the ongoing choice made by individuals across generations to see injustice and refuse to accept it, to stand up for people who need defending, to build communities around honor and service, and the simple truth that every life matters. 50 years after Sarah defended Walt Fisher in O'Malley's bar, a young woman working at a coffee shop in Seattle saw an elderly veteran being harassed. Without hesitation, she stepped in to defend him. When asked why, she said simply, "I grew up hearing the story of Sarah Mitchell. I learned that you don't turn away when someone needs help. You just don't." The ripples continued. The courage remained contagious. And somewhere, Sarah Mitchell's legacy lived on, not just in buildings or organizations, but in individual choices made by ordinary people who refused to accept injustice, who stood up for others, who built communities around the simple truth that we're all responsible for making the world better. One moment of courage, 50 years of ripples, and a legacy that would continue spreading forward into an unknowable future, touching lives yet to be lived, inspiring courage yet to be chosen, proving again and again that individual actions matter, that standing up for what's right can change everything, and that ordinary people, through extraordinary choices, can transform the world. This was Sarah Mitchell's story. But more importantly, it was a story about what's possible when any of us choose courage, when we refuse to turn away, when we stand up for people who need defending, when we build communities around shared values, when we understand that every life matters and that we all have the power and the responsibility to make that truth real through our actions.